For thousands of years, humans could not fly. The sky was forbidden territory. Only birds could be up there. Humans were condemned to walk on the earth, looking up with envy. Gravity was a prison. A prison without walls or bars, but a prison nonetheless. If you tried to rise, you fell. Simple, brutal, final. Think about that for a moment. A world where you can't cross a mountain by flying over it. Where oceans are insurmountable barriers. Where the only way to get from one place to another is walking, on horseback, or by boat. A slow world. Small. Limited. In that world, every time someone watched a bird fly, they felt something painful. It wasn't just admiration. It was frustration. Because birds made it look so easy. They launched into the air and simply flew. Without effort. Without thinking. Why could they do it and we couldn't? That question tormented humanity. And some men couldn't let it go. Some men became obsessed with it. And that obsession killed them. Because trying to fly was suicide. History was full of corpses proving it. Men who jumped from towers with homemade wings. Men who built crazy machines and crashed them into the ground. Again and again the answer was the same. Humans cannot fly. Humans are not made to fly. And if you try, you die. The fall was the punishment. It had always been that way. From the first man who fell from a tree to the inventors of the 19th century, the lesson was clear. What goes up comes down. And when it comes down, it breaks. Bones, skulls, dreams. Everything broke against the ground. The story of Icarus was a warning. The Greek youth who flew with wings of wax and feathers. He got too close to the sun. The wax melted. The wings fell apart. Icarus fell into the sea and died. It was a fable about the dangers of ambition. About not defying the gods. About knowing your place. But there was another message in that story. One that most people ignored. Icarus had flown. Before falling, before dying, he had truly flown. He had felt the wind. He had seen the world from above. He had touched something no other human had touched. And for some men, that moment of flight was worth the price. Even if the price was death. Leonardo da Vinci filled notebooks with designs for flying machines. He drew mechanical wings. Primitive helicopters. He studied how birds flew. He spent years observing them. He dissected dead birds to understand the structure of their wings. He measured the ratio between body weight and wing surface area. He made calculations, diagrams, detailed plans. His notebooks were full of notes written backwards in mirror code, as if the knowledge of flight was too dangerous to write normally. But he never built any of those machines. Or if he did, they never worked. Because Leonardo understood theory, but practice was something else. Paper weighs nothing. Paper doesn't know wind. Ideas don't crash into the ground. Humans do. George Cayley, an English nobleman of the 19th century, went further. He built real gliders. He understood the basic principles of flight. Lift, drag, control. He wrote about them. He made methodical experiments. Cayley was the first to understand that flight had three separate components. Lift to stay in the air. Propulsion to move forward. And control to steer the machine. It was brilliant. Revolutionary. But he himself never flew. He was almost 80 years old when he finally tested one of his gliders. And he didn't test it himself. He convinced his coachman to do it. The poor man got into the contraption. They pushed it from a hill. The glider flew a few yards, wobbling in the air like a wounded bird. Then it landed roughly in a field. The coachman stumbled out, pale, shaking. And he quit on the spot. They didn't pay him enough to risk his life. Cayley tried to convince him to try again. The coachman refused. He had seen enough. Cayley knew how flight should work. But knowing how it should work is not the same as making it work. Between theory and reality there was an abyss. And that abyss was full of danger. And then there was Otto Lilienthal, the German who really tried. Who built gliders and launched himself from hills more than 2,000 times. Who truly flew, gliding in the wind like a huge bird. Otto wasn't a theorist. He was a fanatic. A man possessed by the dream of flight. He built an artificial hill near Berlin just to have a place to launch from. 50 feet high. He called it Flying Hill. On Sundays people came to watch him. Crowds gathered to see the Birdman. Otto would climb to the top of the hill carrying his glider. It was a strange structure. Wings of white fabric stretched over a wooden frame. It looked fragile. It looked suicidal. Otto hung from the center with his arms. The wind blew, and then he launched. And he flew. Not much. Not far. But he flew. He glided through the air, his legs dangling, adjusting his weight to control direction. Sometimes he flew 50 meters. Sometimes 100. Once he reached 300. The crowds applauded. Photographers took pictures. Newspapers published articles. Otto Lilienthal became a celebrity. The man who could fly. But Otto knew the truth. Each flight was a gamble. Each takeoff could be the last. Control was limited. If the wind changed at the wrong moment, there was nothing to do. Just fall and hope to survive. He fell many times. He fractured bones. He dislocated joints. But he kept coming back. The obsession was stronger than the fear. On August 9, 1896, Otto launched from his hill as he had done thousands of times before. It was a Sunday. There were spectators. The weather seemed good. But at 20 meters height, the wind changed. A gust hit him from below. The glider lifted sharply. Otto tried to adjust his weight, but it was too late. The glider stalled in the air. It tilted. And it fell. Otto hit the ground from 15 meters. The impact broke his spine. They took him to a hospital in Berlin. The doctors couldn't do anything. The medical technology of the time couldn't repair such an injury. He died the next day. He was 51 years old. He had flown more than any other human being in history. And he had paid the ultimate price. His last words were, "Sacrifices must be made." Otto Lilienthal's death sent shockwaves around the world. Newspapers published obituaries. Scientists wrote articles. The consensus was clear: human flight was too dangerous. Too deadly. The best of them all had died trying. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe humans were never meant to fly. But for a small group of obsessed individuals, Lilienthal's death meant something different. It meant someone had been very close. Otto had accumulated more flight experience than anyone. He had collected data. He had taken photographs. He had measured angles and speeds. And all of that was available. His notes. His designs. His lift tables. It was a map. A bloodstained map, yes. But a map nonetheless. They just needed to figure out what had gone wrong. And how to fix it without dying in the attempt. The problem of flight wasn't just technical. It was deeper than that. It was a question about what a man was willing to risk. Every attempt to fly was a bet with death. And so far death always won. Bones broke. Spines fractured. Skulls shattered. Those who survived were crippled for life. They limped. They used canes. They lived with constant pain. And still they kept trying. What madness drives a man to risk everything for a dream? What kind of obsession is so strong that it's worth more than your own life? Maybe because the alternative was worse. Living your whole life knowing you never tried. Dying in your bed wondering what would have happened if you'd had the courage to jump. Wondering if you would have been the one who finally succeeded. For some men, that question was more terrifying than the fall. The fear of dying was real. But the fear of not having lived was deeper. Meanwhile, the world kept advancing. And it was impressive what humanity had achieved. At the end of the 19th century, progress was everywhere. Steam trains crossed continents at speeds that would have seemed impossible 50 years earlier. You could have breakfast in New York and dinner in Chicago. Giant steel ships crossed the oceans, transporting thousands of people and tons of cargo. Cities grew upward. Skyscrapers of 10, 20, 30 stories. Structures of steel and glass that defied everything architecture had been before. Electricity lit the streets at night, turning darkness into artificial day. The telegraph sent messages around the world in minutes. You could be in San Francisco and communicate with someone in London almost instantly. The telephone went further, allowing people to talk through wires, hearing each other's voice as if they were in the same room. Photography captured moments in time. Movie cameras created moving images. The phonograph recorded sounds and played them back. Humanity was capturing reality itself, storing it, reproducing it. Factories mass-produced. What used to take weeks of artisan work now took hours. Automobiles were starting to appear on the streets, noisy and smoking, but working. Machines did work that previously required horses and human muscle. Medicine advanced. Doctors understood germs. Anesthesia made surgeries less brutal. Hospitals were places of healing, not death. Humanity had conquered distance. It had mastered fire and metal. It had converted steam into power. It had made machines do the work of 1,000 men. It had illuminated the night. It had accelerated time. But it couldn't fly. It was frustrating. Almost insulting. You could travel from New York to California by train in less than a week. You could cross the Atlantic by ship in a few days. You could send a telegram to London and receive an answer the same day. But if you wanted to cross a valley, you had to go around it. If there was a mountain in your way, you had to tunnel through it or go completely around it. You couldn't just fly over it. The world had become smaller, yes, but only in 2 dimensions. The horizontal. North, south, east, west. All those directions were conquered. But up remained impossible. And it wasn't for lack of trying. There were inventors around the world working on the problem. In France, in Germany, in England, in the United States. Brilliant men with funding and resources. Scientists with formal education and equipped laboratories. But the problem remained unsolved. And it kept killing people. Birds made it look easy. Flies did it. Mosquitoes did it. Even beetles flew. Creatures without brains, without intelligence, without conscious thought, mastered the air with absolute naturalness. Meanwhile, humans, with all their intelligence and technology and ambition, remained stuck on the ground like worms. It was a blow to the ego. Humanity believed itself superior. The pinnacle of creation. The master of the planet. Animals were inferior. Humans were the ones who thought, who built, who dominated. But they couldn't do something a fly did without thinking. The prominent scientists of the time were skeptical. Some said human flight was theoretically possible but practically unattainable. Others said it was simply impossible. The mathematics didn't work. Physics forbade it. Man will not fly for 1,000 years, declared a prominent astronomer in 1895. And most people believed him. Because all the evidence pointed in that direction. Every attempt ended in failure. Every machine crashed. Every inventor ended up dead or injured. Newspapers published stories of the latest disasters. Crowds came to watch flight attempts as entertainment, waiting for the inevitable failure. Maybe it really was impossible. Maybe there were limits that even human progress couldn't overcome. But in an unlikely place, 2 unlikely men weren't listening to the experts. They weren't reading the obituaries. They weren't paying attention to the pessimistic predictions. They were working. Dayton, Ohio. A medium-sized industrial city in the heart of America. 50,000 inhabitants. Machinery factories. Workshops. Modest houses. Dirt roads. It wasn't New York. It wasn't Paris. It wasn't London. It was a place where people worked hard, lived simple lives, and didn't expect to make history. No one important came from Dayton. No one famous lived in Dayton. It was the kind of place that appeared on maps but that no one visited on purpose. In that city there was a bicycle shop. On West 3rd Street. A 2-story building with a workshop upstairs and the shop downstairs. It wasn't big. It wasn't luxurious. But it was functional. And in that shop worked 2 brothers. Wilbur and Orville Wright. They weren't scientists. They didn't have doctorates. They didn't have college degrees. In fact, neither of them had formally finished high school. They didn't have family money. Their father was a preacher, not a millionaire. They didn't have connections to the academic world. They didn't know important professors or have access to university laboratories. They were mechanics. They repaired and sold bicycles for a living. They made enough money to live comfortably, but they weren't rich. They weren't poor, but they didn't have unlimited resources either. No one expected anything extraordinary from them. No one knew them outside of Dayton. They were two middle-aged bachelors who had a bicycle shop. That was all. Wilbur was 36 years old in 1903. He was tall for the time, almost 6 feet. Thin. All sharp angles. Long, serious face. His hair was starting to thin at the forehead. He wore dark suits, shirts with starched collars. He looked like a lawyer or a preacher, not a mechanic. He rarely smiled. He spoke little in public. But when he spoke, he chose his words carefully. Each sentence was thought out. Each argument was solid. There was something intense in his gaze. As if he were always thinking 3 steps ahead. As if he saw things others didn't see. Orville was 4 years younger. Shorter, around 5 feet 8 inches. Sturdier. He wore a carefully trimmed mustache that gave him an almost elegant air. While Wilbur looked like a somber preacher, Orville seemed more accessible. Warmer. He smiled more easily. But both shared the same obsession. The same need to understand how things worked. The same inability to accept that something was impossible just because everyone said so. They weren't twins, but they worked as if they shared a brain. One would start a sentence, the other would finish it. They thought out loud, completing each other's thoughts. They argued constantly, but it wasn't fighting. It was their way of thinking. One would propose an idea. The other would attack it, looking for weaknesses. The first would defend it, refining it. The second would improve it, adding perspectives. And from those intense discussions, sometimes heated, came solutions that neither of them would have found alone. Their father was Milton Wright, a bishop of the Church of the United Brethren in Christ. He was a strict man, religious, with firm and unshakable principles. He traveled constantly preaching, leaving his family for weeks. He was severe but fair. He expected obedience but also encouraged independent thinking. Their mother, Susan Wright, was different. She was practical. She had a mechanical mind. While other women of her time focused on cooking and sewing, Susan fixed things. She built things. She designed mechanical toys for her children. She repaired clocks. She understood gears and pulleys and levers. She taught them to work with their hands. To see problems as puzzles. Not to give up when something didn't work the first time or the second or the 10th. She taught them that almost anything could be fixed or improved if you dedicated enough time and thought to it. When Wilbur was 11 years old and Orville 7, their father returned from one of his preaching trips bringing a gift. It was a toy. A small helicopter made of bamboo, paper, and cork. It had a twisted rubber band that, when released, made 2 propellers spin. Milton launched it into the air in the living room. The small contraption spun, rose toward the ceiling, floated for a moment, and then fell gently to the floor. The children watched it with wide eyes. It was magical. It was impossible. But they had just seen it happen. They chased it around the room when their father launched it again. They studied it closely. They saw how it worked. They carefully took it apart on the kitchen table. They put it back together. And then they tried to make a bigger one. Physics doesn't work that way. You can't just make a bigger model and expect it to work the same. But they were children. They didn't know that yet. So they tried. Their larger version didn't fly as well. But the exercise taught them something. It taught them that size matters. That weight matters. That proportions aren't just arbitrary numbers. That toy eventually broke like all toys. But the curiosity it awakened never died. The seed was planted. Someday, decades later, that seed would grow into an obsession that would consume their lives. The Wright brothers' childhood was fairly normal. They went to public school in Dayton. They read a lot. Their father had an extensive library and let them read whatever they wanted. They built things in the garage. Small projects. Experiments. They weren't child prodigies. They didn't solve complex equations at 5 years old. They didn't build impressive machines in childhood. They were just curious, observant, persistent. Wilbur was brilliant academically. He got excellent grades. He was the type of student teachers loved. He thought deeply about things. He asked questions that went beyond the material. It was expected that he would go to college. Probably Yale. That he would become a professor, maybe a theologian like his father. But at 18, an accident changed his trajectory. He was playing ice hockey on a frozen lake when another player's stick hit him directly in the face. It was an accident. No one was at fault. But the damage was severe. He lost several teeth. His jaw was fractured. His face was disfigured, at least that's how he felt. But the deeper damage was psychological. He fell into a deep depression. He canceled all his college plans. He stayed home for years. He became the caretaker of his mother, who was slowly dying of tuberculosis. He read. He thought. He became a silent shadow in his own house. Susan Wright died in 1889. Wilbur was 22 years old. It was devastating. But it was also a breaking point. As if Wilbur had decided he needed to do something important with his life. Something that mattered. Something that would justify his existence and honor his mother's memory. Orville, meanwhile, had started showing his entrepreneurial side from a young age. At 18, he had already started several small businesses. First, a printing press. He designed and built his own printing press because he couldn't afford a commercial one. It worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. Then he started a newspaper with Wilbur. The West Side News. It wasn't big, but it was theirs. He liked building things and selling them. He was practical. Something didn't work, he fixed it. If he could improve it, he did. When bicycles became popular in the 1890s, the brothers saw an opportunity. Bicycles were the new technology. Everyone wanted them. It was a booming industry. They opened a shop in 1892. The Wright Cycle Company. At first they only sold bicycles made by others. Then they started repairing them. Customers brought broken bicycles and the brothers fixed them. They learned every part, every mechanism, how each piece worked. And eventually they started designing and building their own models. Wright bicycles. They weren't cheap, but they were quality, solid, reliable, well-made. The shop gave them enough money to live comfortably. They didn't get rich, but they didn't have to worry about bills. They had free time. They had an equipped workshop. They had mechanical skills honed by years of work. And they had a curiosity that wouldn't leave them alone. Because bicycles had taught them something crucial about balance. A bicycle shouldn't work. Think about it. It's inherently unstable. It has only two wheels and a line. It should fall over. Gravity should pull it down. But when it's moving, it stays upright. Not by magic. Not by brute force. By dynamic balance. A cyclist doesn't keep the bicycle upright by pushing it with force. They keep it upright by making small constant adjustments. Moving the weight slightly. Turning the handlebars a fraction of an inch. It's subtle. It's instinctive. It's almost impossible to explain in words, but natural to do. The Wrights spent hours watching people learn to ride bicycles. At first everyone fell. They wobbled. They couldn't maintain balance. But then, suddenly, something clicked. The body understood what the mind couldn't explain. And suddenly they could ride. Not because they were stronger, but because they had learned to adjust constantly. And they thought, what if flying is the same? What if it's not about having a more powerful motor, but about having better control? What if the key isn't brute force, but balance? Most inventors were obsessed with power. They wanted bigger motors. Stronger. More horsepower. They thought that if they had enough power, they could force the machine to fly. They could overcome gravity with pure force. The Wrights thought differently. They thought about control. About balance. They didn't want a machine that flew. They wanted a machine they could control while it flew. A machine they could pilot, not just launch into the air and hope for the best. That difference in perspective would change everything. But they didn't know it yet. In 1899 something changed. Wilbur was 32 years old. Orville 28. They had been talking about flight for years. Reading articles in magazines. Discussing the possibilities. But just talking. Then Wilbur read about Otto Lilienthal's death. 3 years had already passed, but the article was new to him. He read how the German had flown more than 2,000 times, how he had studied flight methodically, how he had been so close to success, and how he had died trying. Something ignited in Wilbur. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the feeling that life was slipping away without having done anything significant. Maybe it was just that he had found the right problem for his mind. He decided they were going to solve the problem of flight. Not just study it, not just read about it, solve it. He wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It was formal, polite, almost shy. He introduced himself as an amateur interested in aeronautical research. He asked for any information they could send him. Papers, pamphlets, references, anything. The institution responded. They sent him basic pamphlets, references to works by Cayley, Lilienthal, Chanute. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was more than they had before. The brothers read everything, every word, every diagram. Cayley's works on lift, Lilienthal's experiments with gliders, the studies of Octave Chanute, a French-American engineer who had compiled all the research on flight into a book. They devoured it all. They took notes. They asked questions. They discussed. And they started to see patterns. They started to understand what had worked in the past and what hadn't. What had killed people. Where others had failed. At night, after closing the shop, they went up to their workshop on the second floor. The gas light flickered. The smell of bicycle oil permeated the air. And there, surrounded by tools and parts, they started building. Small models first. Paper wings. Kites with strange shapes. Prototypes they tested in the backyard. Their neighbors saw them and shook their heads. 2 grown men playing with toys. What a waste of time. But the Wrights weren't playing. They were studying. Each model taught them something. Each test revealed a behavior of air they hadn't understood before. They began to understand that air wasn't empty. It was real. It was a physical substance. It had density. It had viscosity. It behaved in predictable ways if you knew what to look for. The problem was you couldn't see it. You couldn't directly touch the air. You couldn't grab it or measure its shape. It was invisible, intangible, but it was there. And if you wanted to fly, you had to learn to understand it. They built a wind tunnel in their workshop. It was rudimentary. A wooden box 6 feet long with a fan at one end and a glass window at the other. Inside they placed small wing models and watched how they behaved. They measured lift with an improvised scale. They tested different shapes, different angles, different surfaces, and they recorded everything meticulously. And that's when they discovered something troubling. Something that would change everything. Lilienthal's data was wrong. Not completely wrong. But it contained significant errors. The tables that everyone used as reference, that everyone assumed were correct, had inaccuracies. Not big ones, but enough to make calculations unreliable. Enough for a glider to behave unexpectedly. Enough for someone to get killed. This scared them. Because it meant they were even more alone than they thought. There was no reliable answer book. There was no guide they could follow. Everyone was working with faulty information. But it also freed them. Because it meant they could trust their own experiments, their own measurements, their own eyes. They didn't have to follow the path of others. They could forge their own. They decided to start without a motor. Just with gliders. Most other inventors were adding motors to machines that couldn't even glide properly. It was like trying to run before learning to walk. The Wrights would learn to walk first. They would master gliding, control, balance. Only when they could completely control a glider without a motor, only then would they add power. It was a sensible plan. Patient, methodical. It was also dangerous. Because it meant they themselves would have to fly these gliders. They would have to launch from hills and trust that their calculations were correct. They would have to bet their lives on their own engineering. But they saw no other option. You couldn't understand flight from the ground. You had to be in the air. Feel the wind. Experience the forces. Learn with your body as much as with your mind. They needed a place to test. They wrote to the United States Weather Bureau. They needed a place with constant winds, with hills, with open space, with a soft surface to cushion the inevitable falls. The Weather Bureau responded with a list of places. One of them was a remote place on the coast of North Carolina, a place that appeared on maps but that no one visited. Kitty Hawk. The name sounded strange, like something made up. It didn't sound like a real place where history would be made. But the data was good. Constant winds of 15 to 20 miles per hour. Sand dunes. Open beach. Isolation. In September of 1900, Wilbur packed his bags. He packed the pieces of the glider in numbered boxes. He said goodbye to Orville, who would stay in Dayton managing the shop for now. The plan was simple. Wilbur would go first. He'd assemble the glider. He'd do preliminary tests. If everything went well, Orville would come later. The trip was long. Train after train. From Ohio to Virginia. Then to North Carolina. And finally a small boat that crossed the Sound to the Outer Banks. Wilbur carried his boxes carefully. Each piece was numbered. Each part had its place. If he lost something, if something broke, there was no way to replace it. There were no hardware stores in Kitty Hawk. There was barely civilization. When he finally arrived, he understood why no one lived there. It was beautiful in a desolate way. Sand dunes stretching as far as the eye could see. The Atlantic Ocean roaring to the east. The calm Sound to the west. And between them sand. Miles and miles of sand. And wind. Constant wind. Wind that never stopped. Wind that blew so hard that the few trees grew tilted, permanently bent in the direction of flow. It was perfect for testing gliders. It was miserable for everything else. There were no hotels. The Coast Guard station was the only solid building for miles. The Coast Guardsmen were friendly. They helped him find a place to camp. They lent him tools. Wilbur set up a tent. It would be his home for the next few weeks. A tent in the dunes. Exposed to the wind. Surrounded by sand that got into everything. Into the food. Into the clothes. Into the eyes. The mosquitoes were enormous. They came in clouds at dusk. They bit through clothing. They made sleep impossible. Wilbur spent nights wrapped in blankets, sweating in the heat, trying to avoid the mosquitoes. Storms appeared out of nowhere. The wind increased. Rain fell horizontally. The tent shook and threatened to fly away. Wilbur held it from inside, hoping it would hold. It was hard. Lonely. Uncomfortable. Dangerous. But when he looked at those dunes and felt that constant wind on his face, he knew he had found the right place. This was the place where they would learn to fly. Or where they would die trying. Wilbur spent the first weeks in Kitty Hawk assembling the glider. It wasn't easy work. He had to do everything alone. The wooden pieces had to fit perfectly. The cables had to be tensioned exactly. The fabric had to be stretched without wrinkles. He worked in the sand under the brutal sun. The heat was stifling during the day. Sweat soaked his shirt. Sand stuck to his skin. His hands filled with splinters and small cuts. But he kept working. Methodically. Carefully. Because every mistake could be fatal. A poorly tensioned cable. A weak connection. Any failure could cause the glider to disintegrate in the air. And if that happened while he was flying, well, he had already seen what happened to Lilienthal. The Wright brothers' first glider was strange. The wings had 17 feet of wingspan. It was a biplane, 2 wings one above the other, connected by cables and struts. The fabric was white muslin stretched over ashwood frames. The pilot didn't sit. He lay face down on the lower wing, head forward. It was an uncomfortable position, but it reduced wind resistance. It made the body more aerodynamic. There was a crucial control the Wrights had added. Something no one else had tried. They could twist the wingtips. Literally bend them. Changing the angle of each tip independently. They had discovered this by observing birds. When a bird wants to turn, it doesn't just move its tail. It twists its wings. One goes up, the other goes down. That creates more lift on one side than the other. The bird tilts and turns. The Wrights called this wing warping, and they thought it was the key to control. Other inventors had tried to control flight by moving the pilot's weight, or using rudders. But wing warping was different. It attacked the problem at its root. It controlled the lift on each wing. If it worked, they would have real control, not just hope. The first tests weren't flights. They were ground tests. Wilbur flew the glider like a kite. Cables kept it tethered to the ground. The wind blew over the dunes. The glider rose into the air with Wilbur controlling it from below. It was strange to watch. This large white structure floating in the air like a giant bird, connected to the earth by cables. Wilbur pulled on the control strings, twisting the wings, seeing how it responded. And it responded. When he twisted the wings, the glider tilted, moved. It turned in the air. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but it worked. The Coast Guardsmen came to watch. At first they thought Wilbur was crazy. A man alone in the dunes flying a giant kite. But there was something about his seriousness that prevented them from mocking. This man wasn't playing. He was working. Orville arrived in September. He took the same long journey as Wilbur. Trains and boats until he reached that remote place at the end of the world. When he saw the camp, he laughed. Not with mockery. With disbelief. This was their new home. A tent in the dunes. No electricity. No running water. None of the comforts of civilization. But he also saw the glider. And that made it all worthwhile. The two brothers worked together, adjusting the design, strengthening connections, improving controls. And when they were ready, when there were no more excuses to delay, the moment came to test a real flight. Not with cables. Not like a kite. A real flight. They chose a high dune near the camp. Not very high. Maybe 30 feet. Enough to get lift. Not so much as to kill you if something went wrong. Although 30 feet was more than enough to break your neck. Wilbur went first. As the older one. As the one who had had the initial idea. It was his right. And his risk. They carried the glider to the top of the dune. The wind blew constantly. Sand flew everywhere. Wilbur lay on the lower wing, gripping the controls. His heart beat hard. He could feel it in his throat. This was real. This wasn't a model. This wasn't a test with cables. This was launching into the void and trusting that his calculations were correct. Orville held one wing. On the count of 3, he would push the glider forward. The wind would do the rest. 1, 2, 3. Orville pushed. The glider slid forward. The edge of the dune disappeared beneath Wilbur. Suddenly there was only air below him. And he flew. Not much. Not far. The glider glided about 15 feet forward. Maybe 3 or 4 feet above the ground. Then it touched the sand gently. It had lasted maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds in the air. Wilbur got out of the glider with shaking legs. He had sand in his mouth. In his eyes. But he was smiling. Or the closest thing to a smile his serious face allowed. He had flown. Really flown. It wasn't much. But it was something. Orville flew after. Same result. A short glide. A soft landing in the sand. Nothing spectacular. But each flight taught them something. How the wind felt. How the glider responded. What worked. What didn't. They spent weeks flying from the dunes. Short flights. 10 feet. 20 feet. Once they managed 100 feet. The glider responded well. The wing warping worked. They could turn. They could control the tilt. But there were also problems. Sometimes the glider tilted too sharply. Sometimes the wind grabbed it and shook it violently. Once Wilbur landed so hard that the glider buried itself in the sand and was partially destroyed. They spent 3 days repairing it. The conditions were brutal. The heat during the day was unbearable. The cold at night made them shiver in their blankets. The mosquitoes were a plague. They came in clouds at dusk and made it impossible to be outside. The food was terrible. Canned beans. Hard bread. Bitter coffee. Sometimes they fished. Sometimes the Coast Guardsmen gave them something. But mainly they ate what they had brought from Ohio, and that was running out. In October a storm came. The wind increased to dangerous speeds. 40-50 miles per hour. Rain fell horizontally. The tent shook and threatened to fly away. The brothers spent the night inside, holding the tent poles, hoping it would hold. Water came in from everywhere. Their blankets got soaked. Everything was wet, cold, miserable. In the morning, the glider was destroyed. The wind had lifted it and crashed it to the ground. The struts were broken. The fabric was torn. Weeks of work ruined in one night. They looked at each other in the gray light of dawn. Soaked. Exhausted. Seeing the remains of their glider scattered in the sand. Orville spoke first. "Well, I guess it's time to go home." Wilbur nodded. "For next year." Because they were already planning to return. The failures hadn't discouraged them. They had educated them. Now they knew what worked, what needed to be improved, what they had to change. They packed what was left. They took detailed notes of everything they had learned. And they returned to Dayton in November of 1900. People in Dayton didn't know what they had been doing. They thought the Wrights had gone on vacation to the beach. Some vaguely knew they were experimenting with kites or something. No one took them seriously. And that was fine with the brothers. They didn't want attention. They didn't want spectators. They didn't want newspapers writing about their failures. They would work in silence. And when they succeeded, then the world would know. They spent the winter in Dayton designing a new glider. A bigger one. Stronger. With better control. They had learned so much in Kitty Hawk. Every flight, every fall, every adjustment had taught them something. They built a better wind tunnel. Bigger. More precise. They tested hundreds of different wing shapes. Long wings. Short wings. Thick wings. Thin wings. Curved wings with different degrees of curvature. And they discovered something important. The shape of the wings' curve mattered enormously. A more pronounced curve gave more lift, but also more drag. A smooth curve gave less lift but was more stable. They had to find the right balance. Otto Lilienthal haunted them. Not literally, of course. He was dead. But his ghost was in everything they did. Every time they got into a glider. Every time they launched from a dune. Every time they felt the wind change unexpectedly. They knew how he had died. A gust of wind. Loss of control. Fall from 15 meters. Broken spine. The Wrights constantly studied his notes. They read about his flights. They looked at photographs of Otto in the air, his legs dangling without real control over the glider's direction. Otto had relied on moving his body weight to control flight. You lean left, the glider turns left. You lean forward, the glider goes down. It was intuitive. Natural. But it was slow. And when the wind changed fast, you couldn't react fast enough. Your body didn't move as fast as the wind. The Wrights understood that wing warping was better. Faster. More direct. You could twist the wings instantly. You didn't have to move your whole body. But there was still danger. There always would be. Air was unpredictable. Wind changed. Invisible currents could grab a glider and throw it to the ground. Every time they flew, they bet their lives. And they knew it. In the winter, Wilbur had nightmares. He dreamed that he was flying and the glider broke in the air. He dreamed that he was falling. He could feel the wind on his face. He could see the ground approaching. And he woke up just before impact, sweating, his heart racing. Orville was more practical. He didn't talk about fear. He focused on technical problems. If we reinforce this connection here, if we adjust this cable this way, if we change the angle of this control. For him, fear was just another problem to solve with engineering. But both knew the truth. This could kill them. Each flight could be the last. They were doing something that had killed other men. More experienced men. Men with more resources. Why did they think they would be different? Maybe because they were more careful. More methodical. They started small. They tested everything exhaustively before risking their lives. They didn't launch from great heights. They didn't try long flights before mastering short ones. Or maybe they were just lucky. For now. In July of 1901, they returned to Kitty Hawk. This time with a bigger glider. 22 feet of wingspan. Almost 300 pounds. The biggest anyone had attempted to fly. They also brought more supplies. They had learned from the previous time. More food, better camping equipment, mosquito nets, basic medicines, and this time they brought a guest. Octave Chanute, the engineer who had compiled all the research on flight. He was almost 70 years old, but he was fascinated by the Wrights' work. He wanted to see their experiments in person. Chanute arrived in August. He was an older man, distinguished, with a white beard. He had seen many flight attempts fail. He had known Otto Lilienthal. He had been present when other inventors had killed themselves. But there was something about the Wrights that impressed him. Their method, their care. They weren't crazy fanatics throwing themselves into the void. They were engineers attacking a problem step by step. The first flights with the new glider were disastrous. It was too big, too heavy. It didn't generate enough lift. Wilbur launched from a dune and the glider barely rose. It fell like a rock hitting the sand hard. Wilbur came out bruised, sore, spitting sand. They tried again. Same result. The glider didn't want to fly. It sank. It crashed. Once it turned sideways and buried itself in the sand, destroying a wing. They spent days repairing, adjusting, changing things. But nothing worked. Wilbur was frustrated, angry. This glider was supposed to be better. They had used all their new knowledge. They had done everything correctly. Why wouldn't it fly? One night, sitting in the tent, Wilbur told Orville, "Man will not fly for 50 years. It was exactly what the skeptics said. What important scientists declared. And for a moment, Wilbur believed it. But only for a moment. The next day they kept working. Because giving up wasn't an option. Not after everything they had invested. Not after coming so far. They discovered the problem eventually. The wing's curve was too pronounced. It was based on Lilienthal's tables, which they already knew had errors. But they had made the mistake of trusting them anyway. They flattened the curve. They made the wing less curved. And suddenly the glider started flying better. Not perfect, but better. Chanute watched everything. He took notes. He asked questions. Sometimes he offered suggestions, although the Wrights didn't always follow them. They had their own ideas, their own method. By the end of August, they started having successful flights. 100 feet, 200 feet. Once Wilbur flew 300 feet, gliding smoothly over the dunes before landing. They were improving, learning. Each flight added to their experience. They were accumulating time in the air. Precious minutes of experience that no one else in the world had. But danger was always present. In one flight, a gust of wind hit Orville from the side. The glider turned sharply. Orville tried to correct, twisting the wings. But the correction was too strong. The glider tilted in the opposite direction. It was falling. The ground was approaching. Orville pulled on the controls desperately. The glider straightened just in time. It hit the sand hard but flat. Orville rolled out, coughing sand but alive. Wilbur ran to him. "Are you okay?" Orville nodded, though he was pale. "I thought that was it." They checked the glider. Minor damage. Reparable. But both were shaking. That had been close. Very close. That night they talked about what had happened. Why the glider had reacted that way. What Orville had done. What he should have done. And they realized something important. When the glider tilted too much, entering what they began to call a spin, twisting the wings could make things worse instead of better. They needed another control. A rudder at the back. Something that could counteract the turn. They would work on that for next year. September came. Then October. The weather was starting to cool. Storms were more frequent. It was time to return to Dayton. They had made more than 400 flights that summer. More than Otto Lilienthal in his entire life. More than any other human being in history. But they still weren't where they wanted to be. They didn't have complete control. They couldn't fly in all conditions. They couldn't turn safely. They couldn't maintain balance when the wind changed sharply. They were still learning. And paying the price in bruises, cuts, and near misses. The winter of 1901 to 1902 was hard. Not because the weather was especially bad, but because doubt had set in. They had been working on the problem of flight for 2 years. They had spent money, time, energy. They had risked their lives dozens of times. And they still couldn't really fly. Only glide for short distances. Was it worth it? Should they give up and focus on their bicycle business? The shop was suffering. They had been absent for months. Customers went elsewhere. Sales were down. If they continued like this, they could lose the business. And for what? To chase a dream that had killed better men than them. Wilbur particularly was depressed. He was 35 years old. Not married. No children. No academic career. He had dedicated years to this project and had nothing to show for it except a workshop full of broken gliders. Catherine, their sister, found him one night in the workshop. He was sitting in the darkness, looking at the remains of the latest glider. Catherine was a teacher. She was practical, direct. "Are you going to give up?" she asked. Wilbur didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Maybe we should." And then what? Sell bicycles for the rest of your life wondering what would have happened? Wilbur looked at her. "We could die, Kate. This is dangerous. Really dangerous." "I know," she said. "But I've never seen you as alive as when you talk about flying. Even when you talk about the failures. Even when you talk about the danger. You're alive in a way you never were before." Wilbur thought about that. She was right. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Something bigger than himself. Something that could change the world. But the price could be his life. Was it worth it? That question haunted him. Kept him awake at night. There was no easy answer. But every morning when he woke up, he went back to the workshop. Kept working. Because giving up meant admitting defeat. And the Wrights didn't know how to do that. In the spring of 1902, they designed a third glider. This one was even bigger. 32 feet of wingspan. And it had a crucial addition, a vertical rudder at the back. They had understood that they needed 3 axes of control. Not just 2. They needed to control roll, the side-to-side tilt. They needed to control pitch, nose up or down. And they needed to control yaw, turning to the sides. Wing warping controlled roll. The front elevator controlled pitch. And now the rear rudder would control yaw. With all 3 controls, theoretically they could fly in any direction. They could turn. They could rise. They could descend. They could maintain balance even when the wind changed. Theoretically. In August of 1902, they returned to Kitty Hawk. This time they knew what to expect. The heat. The mosquitoes. The sand and everything. The sudden storms. It no longer surprised them. They had built a shed. A wooden structure where they could store the glider when not using it. Where they could make repairs protected from wind and sand. It was small. Rudimentary. But it was better than working in the open. There was also another improvement. They had built a launch track. 60 feet of wooden rails. The glider mounted on a cart that ran on the rails. This allowed them to gain speed before takeoff. They no longer had to launch from dunes. The first flights with the new glider were promising. The improved control was noticeable. They could turn more smoothly. They could maintain balance better. Flights were longer. More stable. But then something went terribly wrong. It was late September. The wind was good. Steady at about 15 miles per hour. Wilbur was piloting. He launched from the rails. The glider rose beautifully. 10 feet in the air. 20. 30. Was flying well. Straight. Stable. Wilbur made a gentle turn to the left. The glider responded perfectly. Then he tried to return to center. He twisted the wings to go back to horizontal. And the glider didn't respond. Instead, it kept turning. Faster. The turn became more pronounced. The glider entered a spiral. Falling and spinning at the same time. Wilbur pulled on all the controls. Nothing worked. The ground was approaching rapidly. Spinning. Spinning. Faster. 30 feet above the ground. 20. 10. Wilbur braced for impact. The glider hit the sand at a steep angle. The right wing buried itself. The glider flipped over. Wood broke with sounds like gunshots. Fabric tore. The glider disintegrated in a second. Orville ran toward the wreckage. Wilbur. Wilbur. For one horrible moment there was no response. Only the sound of wind. Then movement among the debris. Wilbur emerged, covered in sand, with blood running down his forehead. "I'm fine," he said, though clearly he wasn't. He was limping. His left arm hung at a strange angle. They took him to the shed. His arm was dislocated at the shoulder. Orville had to reset it. Wilbur gritted his teeth and didn't scream, but sweat ran down his face. The pain was immense. His forehead needed stitches. Orville did them with a needle and thread. They didn't have anesthesia. They didn't have strong medicines. Just whiskey to disinfect the wound. Wilbur spent 3 days in bed. Sore. Feverish. His body was covered in black and purple bruises. Every breath hurt. Maybe he had fractured ribs. And the glider was destroyed. Completely. It wasn't reparable. They would have to build a new one. Orville sat next to Wilbur's bed that night. "You almost killed yourself." Wilbur nodded. He couldn't deny it. He had been seconds from death. If the angle had been slightly different, if he had hit headfirst instead of on the wing, he would be dead. "What happened?" Orville asked. "I don't know. I lost control. The rudder didn't respond. Or it responded wrong. I'm not sure." They spent days analyzing the accident, reviewing every moment, trying to understand what had gone wrong. And eventually they figured it out. The fixed rudder was creating drag when it wasn't needed. At certain angles, instead of helping, it was causing the glider to enter a spin. What they needed was a movable rudder. One the pilot could actively control. It was another lesson learned. Another piece of the puzzle. But it had cost dearly. Wilbur had nearly died. The glider was destroyed. And they were exhausted. When Wilbur could finally move again, limping and sore, they sat outside the shed looking at the ocean. "I don't know if I can do this again," Wilbur said. It wasn't giving up. It was honesty. The accident had shaken him. For the first time he had truly felt how close death was. Not as an abstract concept. As immediate reality. Orville didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "But you already know what went wrong. You already know how to fix it." "Yes." "Then we're closer than before." Wilbur looked at him. His younger brother. More optimistic. More practical. Seeing every failure as information, not as defeat. "We were so close to really flying," Orville continued. "Before the accident you were flying well. Better than ever. We just need to fix the rudder and we'll have it." Wilbur knew he was right. But he also knew that the next time he got into that glider, he would be terrified. The fear that had been abstract was now visceral. Real. He knew exactly how it felt to lose control. He knew how it felt to fall. And he would have to do it again. That was the part that kept him awake at night. Not the fear of dying. But the knowledge that he would have to confront that fear again and again. Every flight. Every takeoff. Every moment in the air. Could he do it? He touched his dislocated shoulder. It still hurt. It would hurt for months. A permanent reminder of how close he had been. But Orville was right. They already knew what had gone wrong. They already knew how to fix it. Giving up now, when they were so close, would be wasting everything they had suffered. All the pain. All the failures. All the flights. Everything would lead to nothing if they gave up now. "Okay," he finally said. "One more time. But this time we make the rudder movable. And I tested extensively on the ground before flying." Orville smiled. "Deal." They returned to Dayton in October. Wilbur was still limping. His shoulder still hurt. People noticed. They asked what had happened. "Bicycle accident," the brothers said. Easier than explaining the truth. Because the truth was too strange. 2 bicycle mechanics trying to fly. Nearly killing themselves in the process. No one would understand. No one would believe it. So they worked in secret. In their workshop. At night. Building. Designing. preparing for the next season, knowing it could be the last, one way or another. The winter of 1902 to 1903 was the most important of their lives, because that winter the Wright brothers finally got it. Finally saw the complete solution. Flight wasn't a matter of power. It wasn't a matter of luck. It was a matter of control. Control in 3 axes. Constant control. Active control. They had been close for years, but they were missing the final piece of the puzzle. The rudder. Before they had used a fixed rudder. It was just there like a fin at the back of the glider. But after Wilbur's accident, after analyzing why he had entered that deadly spiral, they understood the problem. The rudder needed to move. Needed to be controlled by the pilot. And more importantly, it needed to be coordinated with the wing warping. Orville had the crucial idea. Connect the rudder to the wing warping system. When the pilot twisted the wings to turn, the rudder would move automatically in the correct direction. They would work together, like the controls of a bicycle. It was brilliant, simple, obvious in hindsight, but no one else had thought of it. They tested it in the wind tunnel, built models, made calculations, and the numbers worked. Theoretically, this would solve the spin problem, would solve the loss of control. But theory and reality were different things. They had learned that the hard way, many times. They also made another important decision. It was time to add a motor. They had spent 3 years gliding, 3 years learning to control a glider, 3 years accumulating experience that no one else had. That was enough. They already knew how to fly a glider. Now they needed to make a machine heavier than air take off under its own power. Not just dropping from a hill. Not just gliding with the wind. True powered flight. The problem was the engine. They needed one that was light but powerful. They wrote to engine manufacturers, to automotive companies, asking if they could make an engine that weighed less than 200 pounds but produced at least 8 horsepower. Everyone said no. Impossible. Or too expensive. Or they weren't interested in such a strange project. So the Wrights did what they always did when no one else could help them. They did it themselves. They hired Charlie Taylor, their bicycle shop mechanic. Charlie was good with his hands. He understood metal, engines, how to make things work. They showed him the plans, explained what they needed. Charlie scratched his head. He had never built an engine from scratch, but he was willing to try. They worked together for months, in the basement of the workshop, with basic tools, without special equipment. Just knowledge, skill, and determination. The engine they built was crude. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. 4 cylinders, 12 horsepower, 180 pounds. Right within their requirements. They also needed propellers. And here they discovered another problem that no one had solved correctly. Ship propellers wouldn't work. A propeller in air is different from a propeller in water. Air is less dense. It behaves differently. It moves differently. Wilbur and Orville spent weeks arguing about propellers. It was their way of working. Arguing passionately. Sometimes yelling at each other. Sometimes so angry they didn't speak for hours. But they always arrived at the right answer. They realized that a propeller was basically a rotating wing. It had to have the right shape, the right angle, the right curvature. It wasn't just a blade pushing air. It was more complex than that. They designed their own propellers. They carved them by hand. Spruce wood, 8 feet long. 2 propellers, one on each side of the airplane, spinning in opposite directions to cancel out torque. When they finished building everything in the summer of 1903, they had something no one else in the world had. A complete airplane. With engine. With 3-axis controls. With propellers designed specifically for flight. They called it the Flyer. It was strange to look at. The wings were enormous. 40 feet of wingspan. The engine was mounted on the right side of the lower wing. The propellers were at the back, pushing instead of pulling. The pilot lay face down in the center of the lower wing. There were no wheels. Just wooden skids. It took off from a launch rail. A weight dropped from a tower helped propel the airplane forward until it gained enough speed. It weighed over 600 pounds. It was huge. It was heavy. And it was supposed to fly. In September of 1903, they shipped everything to Kitty Hawk. The flyer disassembled in boxes. The engine carefully wrapped. The propellers protected. Hundreds of pounds of equipment. The trip was familiar now. They had made this journey 3 times before. They knew what to expect. The isolation. The wind. The sand. The mosquitoes. Everything. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just a glider. It was a powered machine. If it worked, it would change everything. If it failed, well, at least they would have tried with everything they had. They set up camp in the same place. The shed was still there, beaten by 3 years of storms but still functional. They repaired it. They reinforced it. And they began assembling the flyer. It took weeks. Every piece had to fit perfectly. Every cable had to be tensioned exactly. The engine had to be mounted securely. The propellers had to be balanced. And then they started testing. First they tested the engine. They started it in the shed. It roared. It vibrated. Smoke and noise everywhere. But it worked. It produced power. The propellers spun. Then they tested the complete flyer on the ground. They tied it down with cables. They started the engine. The flyer shook. It vibrated. The propellers spun so fast you could barely see them. The wind they generated was incredible. And the flyer pulled on the cables. It pulled hard. It wanted to move. It wanted to go forward. This could work. It really could work. But then a propeller shaft cracked. They stopped. Orville had to take it back to Dayton to repair it. Weeks lost. November became December. The weather was getting worse. It was cold. The wind was stronger. More unpredictable. It wasn't the ideal season for flying. But they couldn't wait until next spring. They had been at this too long. They had invested too much. They needed to know if it worked. Now, while waiting for Orville to return with the repaired shaft, Wilbur thought about Otto Lilienthal. About how he had died. About all the others who had died chasing this dream. The flyer was more dangerous than the gliders. Heavier. Faster. More powerful. If something went wrong, if the engine failed in the air, if the controls didn't respond, the fall would be worse. Faster. More deadly. Wilbur was 36 years old. Orville 32. They weren't young. They weren't immortal. This could easily kill them. Was it worth it? He asked himself that question constantly. And the answer was always the same. Yes. Because if they didn't do it, someone else would eventually. And all their work, all their suffering would have been for nothing. They would rather die trying than live wondering what would have happened. Orville returned on December 11th. He brought the repaired shaft. And he brought news. Samuel Langley, Secretary of the Smithsonian, had attempted to fly his own powered airplane in Washington, D.C. Twice. Both times it had crashed into the Potomac River seconds after launch. Langley had spent $50,000 of government money. He had had access to the best engineers, the best materials, all the support money could buy, and he had failed completely, spectacularly, in front of reporters and photographers. The newspapers mocked him. They declared that powered flight was impossible, a fantasy, a waste of money. The Wrights said nothing. They just installed the repaired shaft and kept working. On December 14th, they made their first attempt. They flipped a coin to see who would fly first. Wilbur won. They mounted the flyer on the launch rail. Wilbur lay in position. Orville and the helpers from the Coast Guard station held the wings. The engine roared. The propellers spun. Wilbur released the restraining mechanism. The flyer started sliding down the rail. Faster. Faster. The wind in his face. The deafening noise of the engine. And it rose. For 1 second, 2 seconds, it was in the air. The wheels of the cart lifted off the rail. The flyer was flying. But Wilbur pulled too hard on the elevator control. The nose lifted too sharply. The flyer stalled in the air. It tilted. And it fell. It hit the sand. Not hard. But enough to damage the front skid and some structures. Wilbur came out unharmed. Frustrated but unharmed. He had flown for only 3.5 seconds. And technically it didn't count because it had taken off from a downward slope. They spent 2 days repairing. The 15th and 16th were days of constant work. Replacing broken pieces. Adjusting. Preparing. December 17th dawned cold. Very cold for Kitty Hawk. The wind blew at 27 miles per hour. Gusts of over 30. The water in puddles had ice. It wasn't a good day for flying. It was dangerous. The wind was too strong. Too irregular. But the Wrights had already waited long enough. They hung a flag. The signal for the men from the Coast Guard station. 5 men came. Curious. Willing to help. They didn't expect to see history. They just thought they would see another failed attempt. Maybe another accident. It was entertainment in a place where nothing interesting happened. They mounted the flyer on the rail. It was level this time. No downward slope. If it flew, it would be real flight. Without gravity's help. It was Orville's turn. Wilbur had gone first the previous time. It was only fair that Orville have this opportunity. Orville lay on the wing. He gripped the controls. His heart beat so hard he could hear it over the wind. This was real. This was happening. Wilbur held the right wingtip. He looked at his brother. Ready? Orville nodded. He didn't trust his voice. The engine roared. The propellers spun. The flyer vibrated with contained power. Orville released the mechanism. The flyer started moving. Slowly at first. Then faster. Sliding down the 60-foot rail. Wilbur ran alongside, holding the wing, keeping it level. 40 feet. 50. 60. The flyer lifted off the rail. And it flew. Time seemed to stop. Orville was in the air. Really in the air. The ground was below him. The sky around him. The roar of the engine. The cold wind. Everything was real. The flyer went up and down. Up 10 feet. Down to 6. Up again. The wind shook it. Orville fought with the controls. Adjusting. Correcting. Fighting to maintain balance. It was difficult. Much more difficult than the gliders. The engine added weight. Speed. Complexity. Everything was more violent. More immediate. But he was flying. Really flying. With engine. Not falling from a hill. Not being pushed by wind. The engine kept him in the air. The engine propelled him forward. 120 feet. The flyer descended. It touched the sand. Gently. The skid slid. It stopped. 12 seconds. 120 feet. At 10 feet above the ground. Orville got out shaking. Not from fear. From excitement. From pure adrenaline. He had flown. He had flown a heavier-than-air-powered machine. The men from the Coast Guard station shouted. They applauded. They didn't completely understand what they had just witnessed. But they knew it had been extraordinary. Wilbur walked to Orville. For a moment they just looked at each other. Then Wilbur extended his hand. Orville shook it. They said nothing. There were no words for this. But they weren't done. They wanted more flights. They wanted to prove the first one wasn't luck. They dragged the flyer back to the rail. They checked it. No damage. Ready to fly again. Wilbur went next. He flew 175 feet. 13 seconds. Better than Orville's flight. Then Orville again. 200 feet. 15 seconds. And finally Wilbur one last time. This flight was different. Wilbur was gaining confidence. Understanding the controls. Feeling how the flyer responded. He flew. And flew. And kept flying. The flyer rose to 15 feet. Then down to 8. Then up again. Up and down like a dolphin in the air. 800 feet. 900. The wind pushed it. Wilbur corrected. The flyer responded. A strong gust hit it. The flyer tilted sharply. Wilbur pulled on the controls. Too hard. The front elevator dug into the sand. The flyer stopped abruptly. It flipped over. Wood cracked. Fabric tore. Wilbur rolled out. Bruised but unharmed. He stood up spitting sand. 59 seconds. 852 feet. Almost a minute in the air. almost 1,000 feet of distance. They dragged the flyer back to the shed. While they were doing it, a gust of wind lifted it, flipped it, crashed it to the ground several times before they could stop it. The damage was extensive. The flyer would never fly again. But it didn't matter anymore, because it had flown 4 times. With witnesses, with photographs. It was real. It was undeniable. On December 17, 1903 at 10:35 in the morning, humanity had flown for the first time. Not gliding. Not falling with style. Flying. With engine. Controlled. Sustained. That night, Orville sent a telegram home. To their father. To Catherine. It said, "Success. 4 flights Thursday morning. All against 21-mile wind. Started from level with engine power alone. Average speed through air 31 miles. Longest 59 seconds. Inform press. Home Christmas." The telegram arrived in Dayton. The family read it. Catherine cried. Their father, the stern Bishop Milton Wright, smiled. His sons had done it. But when they tried to inform the press, almost no one believed them. The Dayton Daily News published a small article. Buried in the inside pages. A few paragraphs. No photographs. Local flying machine airborne. As if it were a minor curiosity. The national newspapers ignored it completely. The New York Times published nothing. The Washington Post nothing. The big newspapers that had covered Samuel Langley's spectacular failures weren't interested in 2 mechanics from Ohio who said they had flown. What? Because Langley had just failed. Twice. With $50,000. With all the authority of the Smithsonian behind him. Experts had declared that powered flight was impossible. That it would take decades more of development. Maybe it would never be achieved. And now 2 unknowns said they had done it with a few $100s in a remote place without important witnesses? Sounded like a lie. Like exaggeration. Like attention-seeking. The scientific press was worse. They called the Wrights liars. Charlatans. Publicity seekers. Scientific American published a skeptical article. Others ignored it completely. Some newspapers published the story, but with completely invented details. They said the flight had been 3 miles. Or that the flyer had flown in circles. Or that it had reached 1,000 feet altitude. All false. The Wrights tried to correct the information. They sent letters. They offered technical details. They explained exactly what they had achieved and how. No one listened. It was frustrating. Maddening. They had achieved the impossible. They had solved a problem that had defied humanity for millennia. They had risked their lives dozens of times. And the world didn't believe them. Part of the problem was they didn't have good photographs of the flight. John Daniels, one of the Coast Guardsmen, had taken a photo of Orville's first takeoff. But it was blurry. Unimpressive. The flyer was low. Barely visible. It didn't look like the historic moment it was. It looked like a man lying on a strange contraption floating a few feet above the ground. Skeptics pointed to this. That's it? That's your great achievement? It's 3 meters off the ground. They didn't understand. They didn't grasp the importance. For the first time in history, a heavier-than-air machine had taken off under its own power. It had flown under control. It had landed safely. That was all that mattered. The altitude. The distance. That would come later. But people wanted spectacle. They wanted to see someone fly over buildings. Do aerobatics. Travel miles. 12 seconds at 3 meters off the ground didn't impress anyone. The Wrights decided not to waste time convincing the press. Instead, they would keep working. They would build a better flyer. They would fly longer distances. They would perform more impressive maneuvers. And then the world would have no choice but to believe. They spent 1904 building Flyer 2. They learned from the mistakes of the first one. They made the engine more powerful. They improved the controls. They reinforced the structure. And they found a new place to fly. They couldn't keep going to Kitty Hawk. It was too far. Too expensive. Too much time lost. They found a field near Dayton. Huffman Prairie. It was flat. open. Perfect for practicing. The problem was it had no hills. And the wind wasn't as consistent as in Kitty Hawk. So they needed a better launch system. They built a catapult. A wooden tower with a heavy weight. The weight fell and pulled on a rope connected to the flyer. This gave the airplane enough speed to take off from flat ground. In May of 1904, Orville made the first flight of Flyer 2. 60 feet. 6 seconds. A modest start. But there was a crucial difference. There were reporters present. People from town. Real witnesses. And they saw the flyer fly. Not much. Not far. But fly. Local newspapers published stories. With photographs. With witness testimonies. Wright flying machine makes successful flight. But the national newspapers still weren't convinced. They needed more proof. Longer flights. More impressive. The Wrights kept practicing. Almost every day. When weather permitted. They flew. They crashed. They repaired. They flew again. Each flight was better. Longer. More controlled. They were learning to really pilot. Not just take off and land. To fly. In September, Wilbur completed the first full circle. He flew in a closed circle and returned to the starting point. 4,000 feet of distance. A minute and a half in the air. It was a huge achievement. It demonstrated real control. Not just flying in a straight line. Turning. Maneuvering. Returning. But when reporters came the next day, the flyer didn't fly. The engine had problems. The weather didn't cooperate. The reporters waited for hours and saw nothing. They left disappointed. Skeptical. These guys are frauds, one wrote. They say they can fly, but they never do it when important witnesses are present. It was unfair. Frustrating. But it was reality. Flight was still so temperamental. The engine failed. Weather changed. You couldn't schedule a flight like a show. By the end of 1904, the Wrights had made 105 flights. The longest had lasted 5 minutes. They had flown more than 3 miles total. They had more flight experience than any other human being in history. They knew how to control an airplane, how to turn, how to maintain balance, how to land safely. But still almost no one believed them. In 1905 they built Flyer 3. Even better. More powerful. More stable. With this airplane they finally mastered flight. In October, Wilbur flew for 39 minutes. 24 miles. 30 complete circles over Huffman Prairie. The engine never failed. The controls responded perfectly. It was a perfect flight. There were witnesses. Dozens of them. Local farmers. People from town. Everyone saw the flyer circle and circle over the field. It was undeniable. Impossible to ignore. And finally, the press started paying attention. But by then, the Wrights had made a decision. They would stop flying in public. They would stop giving free demonstrations. Because now they knew they had something valuable. Something governments and militaries would pay to obtain. They had the technology to fly. And they weren't going to give it to the world for free. It was a practical decision. They had spent years of their lives. Thousands of dollars. They had risked their lives dozens of times. And they weren't rich. They needed this to be worth it financially. So they stopped flying. They stored Flyer 3. And they started negotiating. With the United States government. With European governments. With businessmen. They wanted contracts. Money. Protected patents. No more free demonstrations. The world finally wanted to believe. Finally wanted to see. And the Wrights said, fine. But you'll have to pay. They spent 2 years negotiating. 2 years without flying. Meanwhile, other inventors in Europe were making their own attempts. Some were successful. Short flights. Clumsy. But flights. The technology was spreading. Others were learning. The Wrights were still ahead. Still knew more. But their advantage was shrinking. Finally, in 1908 they got contracts. With the United States Army. With a French syndicate. It was time to demonstrate what they could do. Wilbur went to France. Orville stayed in the United States to demonstrate the flyer to the Army. For the first time in their lives, the brothers separated. They would work alone, without the other to argue with, to refine with, to support. It was terrifying, but necessary. In France, Wilbur caused a sensation. The French were skeptical at first. They had heard the Wright's claims. They had read about the supposed flights, but they didn't believe. Then Wilbur flew. On August 8, 1908 at Le Mans, Wilbur took off in a rebuilt flyer. And he flew. But not like the clumsy French attempts. He flew with control. With grace. He made sharp turns. Figure eights. He climbed. He descended. He did whatever he wanted with the airplane. The crowd fell silent. Then burst into applause. The French, who had been the most skeptical, became the most fervent believers. "We are nothing," declared a French aviator. "The Wrights are everything." Wilbur became a celebrity. Kings came to see him fly. Crowds of thousands. Newspapers covered it daily. The quiet man from Ohio was now famous worldwide. Meanwhile, in the United States, things were going worse for Orville. He was doing demonstrations at Fort Myer, Virginia. For the Army. The flights were going well. Impressive. The officers were pleased. Then, on September 17, 1908, Orville took a passenger. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. An Army officer interested in aviation. They took off. The flight was going well. 4 minutes in the air. 75 feet altitude. Orville was completing a circle when he heard a strange sound. Like something hitting. Rhythmic. Loud. A propeller had cracked. It had become unbalanced. The vibrations were violent. Then the propeller disintegrated. The pieces cut the control cables. The rudder came loose. Orville lost all control. The flyer tilted. The nose dropped. They were falling. From 75 feet. Orville pulled on the controls desperately. Nothing responded. The flyer crashed into the ground. The impact was brutal. Wood exploded. Metal bent. The engine broke loose and tore through the structure. Orville was trapped in the wreckage. Unconscious. Bleeding. Selfridge too. Rescuers ran to the site. They pulled both men out. Orville was alive. Barely. He had fractures in his leg. In his hip. Several broken ribs. He was in shock. Selfridge was worse. He had a fractured skull. He died 3 hours later. The first passenger to die in a powered airplane accident. Orville spent 7 weeks in the hospital. In agony. Doctors weren't sure if he would walk again. The hip fracture was severe. The leg was shattered. Wilbur, in France, received the news by telegram. He was devastated. His brother had almost died. A man had died. The flyer had crashed. Everything they had built could fall apart. The Army might cancel the contract. The public might turn against them. They would accuse them of building deadly machines. But something strange happened. The public didn't turn against them. Instead, there was sympathy. Orville had been demonstrating new technology. He had been pushing boundaries. Accidents were part of progress. Selfridge was honored as a hero. A pioneer who died advancing science. And the Army didn't cancel the contract. They just postponed it until Orville recovered. Orville spent months recovering. He learned to walk again. With pain. With difficulty. His hip would never heal completely. He would limp for the rest of his life. But he survived. And when he could, he flew again. Because giving up meant Selfridge's death had been for nothing. It meant fear had won. And the Wrights didn't know how to give up. In 1909 they completed the demonstrations. They fulfilled the contracts. The Army bought the flyer. The French bought licenses. The Wrights finally received recognition. Finally received money. Finally the world understood what they had achieved. But the price had been high. Years of work. Hundreds of dangerous flights. Countless accidents. Orville's body was permanently damaged. Selfridge was dead. And this was just the beginning. Because now that the world knew flight was possible, everyone wanted to do it. Other inventors. Other companies. Other countries. The Wrights had opened a door. and there was no way to close it again. The sky, which had been closed throughout human history, was now open, and humanity would rush into it, with all the glory, and with all the horror that would entail. The Wright brothers had opened the sky, and humanity filled it with horror. Not immediately. The first years after 1903 were innocent, full of wonder. People saw airplanes flying and marveled. It was magical, impossible, a dream come true. Air shows became popular. Pilots flew over crowds, did tricks, flew low, flew between buildings. People paid to see them. Pilots became celebrities, heroes. But the military saw something different. They saw a tool, a weapon. From the beginning, the Wrights had negotiated with armies. The United States government, France, Germany, England. Everyone wanted airplanes. Not for shows, for war. At first, militaries thought of airplanes as reconnaissance tools. You could fly over enemy lines, see their positions, count their troops, report their movements. Eyes in the sky. It was strategic, valuable, but not directly lethal. That didn't last long. Someone had the idea of dropping objects from airplanes. First just markers, small smoke bombs to signal positions, then grenades, then real bombs. In 1911, during a war in Libya, an Italian pilot dropped the first bomb from an airplane in combat. It was small. It didn't cause much damage, but it proved the concept. Airplanes could kill from the sky. Wilbur and Orville watched this develop with a mixture of fascination and horror. They weren't naive. They knew militaries would use their airplanes for war. They had sold airplanes to armies specifically for that purpose. But one thing was knowing it in theory. Another was seeing the first photographs of bombed cities, of civilians killed by explosives dropped from the air. Wilbur particularly was disturbed. "I never imagined," he told Orville one night in 1912, "that our invention would be used to kill innocent people." Orville was more pragmatic. All technologies are used for good and for evil. Knives cut food and cut throats. We can't control how people use what we invent. "Maybe we should have tried," Wilbur said. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. By 1914, almost every major nation had military airplanes. Entire squadrons. Hundreds of machines. And then World War I began. What started as a trench war on the ground quickly became a war in the sky. At first, airplanes only did reconnaissance. Pilots from opposite sides would wave at each other when they crossed in the air, chivalrously, as if they were sportsmen, not enemies. Then someone started carrying pistols, shooting at enemy airplanes, then rifles, then machine guns mounted on the airplanes. By 1915, the sky was full of aerial combat. Airplanes chasing each other, shooting at each other, crashing. Pilots died every day, dozens of them. Young men in their 20s who had learned to fly barely months before. The life expectancy of a combat pilot was weeks, not months, not years, weeks. Combat airplanes were fragile, made of wood and fabric. A single bullet in the wrong place and the airplane disintegrated. Or worse, it caught fire. Pilots didn't have parachutes. If your airplane caught fire, you had two options: burn alive or jump. Most jumped. The bombing became more sophisticated. No longer just grenades thrown by hand. Real bombs. Big ones. Destructive ones. Airplanes flew over cities and dropped death from above. London was bombed. Paris. Berlin. Thousands of civilians died. People who had never been on a battlefield. Who weren't soldiers. Who were just living their lives when explosives fell from the sky. This was the new reality of war. The front was everywhere. There was no safe place. If the enemy had airplanes, they could reach you wherever you were. The Wrights watched from Dayton. They read the reports. They saw the photographs. They counted the deaths. Wilbur was sick. Not just in spirit. Really sick. He had contracted typhoid fever in 1912. He recovered, but never completely. His body was weakened. His spirit too. Seeing his invention turned into a war machine was killing him. Not literally, maybe. But something inside him was breaking. "We built something beautiful," he told Catherine in the spring of 1912, "and the world turned it into something horrible." "It's not your fault," she said. "Isn't it? We made it possible. Without us, this wouldn't be happening. Someone else would have invented it. If not you, another. Flight was inevitable. But it was us. And we'll have to live with that." Except Wilbur wouldn't live much longer. In May of 1912, Wilbur started feeling bad. Fatigue, fever, headache. He thought it was just exhaustion. He had been working too hard, dealing with lawsuits, with competitors copying their designs, with the pressure of running an aviation company. But it got worse. The fever rose. The pain intensified. Doctors came. They diagnosed typhoid fever, a disease caused by contaminated water, common in that time, often fatal. Wilbur spent weeks in bed, delirious, sweating, his body fighting the infection. Doctors couldn't do much. There were no antibiotics. They could only keep him hydrated and hope his body won the battle. It didn't. Wilbur Wright died on May 30th, 1912. He was 45 years old. The man who had conquered the sky died from dirty water. The irony was cruel. He had survived dozens of accidents. He had flown hundreds of times. He had risked his life constantly. And he died in his bed from a disease that a child with modern antibiotics would overcome in days. Orville was devastated. They had been a team their entire lives. They had thought together, worked together, argued together. Without Wilbur, Orville felt incomplete, as if half his brain had been taken away. The funeral was large. Thousands of people came. Dayton closed for a day. The man no one had taken seriously 15 years earlier was now honored as a national hero. But Orville barely noticed the crowds, barely heard the speeches. He could only think about his brother, about all the conversations they would never have, about all the flights they would never make together. Catherine asked him if he would continue with aviation, if he would keep flying. Orville said yes, that it was what Wilbur would have wanted. But it was never the same. Orville ran the Wright Company for a few more years. But his heart wasn't in it. He flew occasionally, but without enthusiasm. It was as if part of him had died with Wilbur. He sold the company in 1915. He left the aviation business. He spent the rest of his life defending their legacy, fighting with the Smithsonian Institution over who had flown first, writing articles, giving interviews. But he never built another airplane, never innovated again. The spark had gone out. Orville lived until 1948. He lived to see World War II. He lived to see giant bombers drop thousands of tons of explosives on cities. He lived to see Hiroshima and Nagasaki destroyed by atomic bombs dropped from airplanes. He lived to see the sky become the source of the greatest destruction humanity had known. What did Orville think when he saw those images? The mushroom clouds over Japan? When he knew that 150,000 people had died instantly from bombs dropped from the air? He never said publicly, but one can imagine. The weight of knowing your invention had made such horror possible, that your dream of flight had become a nightmare for millions. Orville died in 1948, 36 years after Wilbur, alone. His sister Catherine had died years before. His brother Wilbur had died decades before. Most of the people who had known the first flight were dead. But his invention lived, in ways they never would have imagined. Because the 20th century became the century of flight. For better and for worse. World War I ended. Airplanes had played a crucial role. They had changed the nature of war forever. And when peace came, those airplanes didn't disappear. They adapted. They transformed. War airplanes became mail airplanes, passenger airplanes. The United States government started hiring pilots to carry mail across the country. It was dangerous. Pilots flew in all weather conditions. Many died. But it was faster than train, more efficient. And it proved that flight could be commercial, could be a business. In 1919, two British pilots crossed the Atlantic for the first time, John Alcock and Arthur Brown. They flew from Newfoundland to Ireland. Almost 3,000 kilometers. 16 hours in the air. It was brutal. The airplane was open. No pressurized cabin. No heating. They flew through storms. Through fog. Through ice forming on the wings. Brown had to climb onto the wings mid-flight to remove ice with his hands. But they made it. And they proved that oceans were no longer barriers. You were no longer trapped on your continent. You could cross. You could go anywhere. In the 20s, aviation exploded. Airlines started forming. KLM in Holland. Air France in France. Pan Am in the United States. At first they mainly carried mail. Occasionally rich and brave passengers. The airplanes were small. Uncomfortable. Noisy. Dangerous. Accidents were common. But they constantly improved. Bigger. Faster. Safer. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone. New York to Paris. 33 hours. Non-stop. No co-pilot. Just him and the airplane and the endless ocean below. He became the most famous man in the world. Crowds of millions cheered him. Newspapers published special editions. He was a hero. A symbol of what humanity could achieve. Lindbergh proved that transatlantic flight was viable. That it was only a matter of time before it became routine. And he was right. By the 30s, you could take a commercial flight from New York to London. It took days. You made multiple stops. You slept in hotels along the way. But it was possible. And it was much faster than a ship. Airplanes also changed how we lived. Suddenly, inland cities mattered as much as ports. Because you could fly directly to them. Dallas, Denver, Chicago. You no longer needed to be on the coast to be connected to the world. Airplanes carried fresh products. Flowers from Colombia arrived in New York in hours. Fish from Alaska to restaurants in California. The world was getting smaller. More accessible. But also more dangerous. Because while commercial airplanes connected the world, military airplanes were becoming more lethal. Bigger. More destructive. By 1939, when World War II began, bombers could carry tons of explosives. They could fly thousands of kilometers. They could destroy entire cities. And they did. London was bombed night after night. The Blitz. Thousands of bombs falling on the city. Buildings destroyed. Families buried under rubble. Tens of thousands dead. Germany was bombed even worse. The Allies launched massive bombing campaigns. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. Entire cities burned to the ground. Hundreds of thousands of civilians dead. In the Pacific, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The Americans bombed Tokyo. Both sides used the sky as battlefield, as weapon of terror. And then came the atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ultimate end of military aviation. The ability to destroy an entire city with a single bomb dropped from a single airplane. The Enola Gay took off the morning of August 6, 1945. A B-29 bomber. It carried a bomb called Little Boy. It flew over Hiroshima. It dropped the bomb. And it flew away. The bomb exploded at 600 meters above the city. A light brighter than 1,000 suns. A heat that vaporized everything at ground zero. A shockwave that flattened buildings for kilometers. 70,000 people died instantly. Another 70,000 would die in the following months from radiation and burns. 3 days later, another bomb over Nagasaki. 40,000 more dead. The war ended days later. Japan surrendered. And the world entered a new era. The nuclear age. Where a single bomb dropped from a single airplane could kill millions. The Wrights had wanted to fly. They had dreamed of freedom. Of beauty. Of conquering the sky. And humanity had used it to create the most destructive weapon ever conceived. But that wasn't the whole story. Because flight was also beautiful. Also liberating. Also changing lives for the better. After the war, commercial aviation really exploded. Airplanes that had been bombers became passenger planes. Pilots who had flown combat missions now flew commercial routes. The Douglas DC-3 revolutionized travel. It could carry 21 passengers comfortably. It was reliable, efficient, relatively safe. By the 50s, thousands of DC-3s flew around the world. You could have breakfast in New York and dinner in Los Angeles. You could be in Paris in the morning and London in the afternoon. The world was contracting. Distances meant less and less. In 1952, the de Havilland Comet became the first jet passenger airplane. It was fast, smooth, quiet compared to propeller planes. It flew higher above the storms. It had problems. Some disintegrated in the air. Metal fatigue. But those problems were solved, and jets became the standard. In 1969, the Boeing 747 made its first flight. The jumbo jet. It could carry 400 passengers. Across oceans. From continent to continent. At speeds of 900 kilometers per hour. Air travel democratized. It was no longer just for the rich. The middle class could fly. Families took vacations in other countries. Students studied abroad. Businesses operated globally. By the end of the 20th century, 1 billion people flew every year. Billion. Going everywhere. Connecting cultures. Mixing ideas. The world had become truly global. And airplanes were the main reason. Cities that had been isolated became global centers. Dubai. Singapore. Hong Kong. Places built on the understanding that being far away didn't matter if you had an airport. Airplanes carried humanitarian aid. Food to famine regions. Medicine to disaster zones. Rescue teams to remote places. Yes, airplanes could kill. But they could also save. Airplanes allowed people to fall in love across continents. Allowed families separated by oceans to reunite. Allowed businesses to operate in multiple countries. Allowed ideas to spread instantly. And airplanes became symbols. Symbols of progress. Of modernity. Of freedom. Amelia Earhart became a hero flying alone across the Atlantic. The first woman to do it. She proved that flight wasn't just for men. That anyone with courage and skill could conquer the sky. Her disappearance in 1937 while trying to circumnavigate the globe only increased her legend. She became a symbol of ambition, of adventure, of reaching beyond the safe. Astronauts took the dream of flight even further. Yuri Gagarin in 1961, the first human in space, orbiting Earth, seeing the entire planet from above. Neil Armstrong in 1969, walking on the moon, a direct descendant of the Wrights. Because without the Wrights, without that first flight at Kitty Hawk, none of this would have been possible. Every step toward space was a step that began with two brothers on a sand dune, with 12 seconds in the air, with the belief that the impossible was just a problem waiting to be solved. Airplanes changed how we saw the world. Literally. From the air, borders disappear. Countries look like arbitrary lines. Mountains that seemed insurmountable from the ground are just wrinkles in the landscape. Seeing Earth from above changes your perspective. Makes you smaller. Makes your problems seem insignificant. But it also makes you part of something bigger. Part of a species that can fly. That can leave its home planet. That can reach for the stars. Flight became metaphor. Became symbol. Reach new heights. Let your dreams take flight. Rise above your problems. The language of flight infiltrated how we talk about aspiration and success. Because flying represents something fundamental in the human spirit. The refusal to accept limits. The belief that we can be more than we are. That we can overcome our limitations. That we can touch the impossible. The Wrights understood this. They didn't just build a machine. They built a dream. A dream that had haunted humanity for millennia. From Icarus to Leonardo. From ancient legends to modern fantasies. And they made it real. Not perfectly. Not without cost. But they did it. Today, more than 120 years after Kitty Hawk, we live in a world they made possible. A world where 20,000 airplanes are in the air at any moment. Where you can be anywhere on the planet in less than 24 hours. Where the sky is filled with metal and dreams. There are airports in every major city. There are air routes over every ocean. There are airplanes carrying people, products, ideas, to every corner of the world. Constantly. Without stopping. The Wrights died without seeing most of this. Wilbur died when aviation was still a curiosity. Orville lived to see the beginning but not the full maturity. But their legacy is in every airplane. Every wing has warping because they invented it. Every airplane has a rudder because they understood why it was necessary. Every pilot uses 3-axis control because the Wrights discovered it. Technology has advanced incredibly. Modern airplanes are miracles of engineering. Composite materials. Fly-by-wire systems. Jet engines. Computers making calculations thousands of times per second. But the basic principles are the same. Lift, control, balance. The same things the Wrights studied in their wind tunnel. The same things they learned crashing in the dunes of Kitty Hawk. At the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, the original flyer hangs from the ceiling. The same airplane that flew on December 17, 1903. Restored, preserved, honored. Millions of people have seen it. Children look up. It seems fragile. It seems impossible that something like that could fly. Wood and fabric. Cables and hope. But it flew. And it changed everything. The children who look at it today live in a world the Wrights created. A world where flight is routine. Boring even. Where you complain about airport delays, not marvel that you're about to fly. But that routine is the triumph. That's what the Wrights wanted. Not for flight to be special, but for it to be normal, accessible, for anyone to be able to do it. And so it is. Every day millions of people fly. Most arrive at their destination safely. It's extraordinarily safe compared to driving. Compared to almost any other form of transportation. Accidents still happen. Airplanes still crash. But they're rare. Newsworthy. Tragedy. Not the norm. The Wrights would have been proud of that. To know their invention became so safe. So reliable. So common that people take it for granted. Because that means they won. That they solved the problem. That their work was worth it. Yes, their invention was used for war. For destruction. For horror. That's undeniable. The bombing of cities. The atomic bombs. Terror dropped from the sky. But it was also used for connection. For exploration. For progress. For saving lives. For uniting humanity. Flight is what we make of it. Like all tools. Like all technology. It can be weapon or it can be wing. It can destroy or it can liberate. The Wrights gave us the capability. We choose how to use it. And mostly we've used it well. Not perfectly, but well. The world is more connected. More accessible. Smaller in the good sense. You can meet someone online who lives on the other side of the world and visit them in person days later. You can study at universities on other continents. You can work in one country and live in another. You can experience cultures your grandparents never could have seen. All because two brothers in Ohio refused to accept that the sky was closed. Refused to believe that man couldn't fly. Refused to give up when all the experts said it was impossible. They survived brutal accidents. Fractures. Concussions. Falls that could have easily killed them. They worked in miserable conditions. With limited resources. Without institutional support. And they succeeded. Not because they were geniuses. Not because they were rich. Not because they had special advantages. They succeeded because they were stubborn. Because they were methodical. Because they treated every failure as a lesson, not as defeat. Because they refused to give up. That's the true lesson of the Wrights. Not the specific technology. Not the diagrams or equations. It's the attitude. The persistence. The belief that problems can be solved if you work hard enough. Flight was impossible. Until it wasn't. And it changed everything. The sky that had been closed throughout human history is now full of us. Full of our dreams. Our ambitions. Our commerce. Our connections. And it all started with 12 seconds. With 120 feet. With two brothers who refused to accept limits. Wilbur and Orville Wright didn't just build an airplane. They built a bridge. A bridge between earth and sky. between impossible and real, between dream and reality, and we cross that bridge every day. Every time an airplane takes off, every time someone travels to a new place, every time a child looks up and sees an airplane and thinks, I want to do that. The Wrights conquered the sky, and they gave us the wings to follow them. Their legacy isn't just technological, it's philosophical. It's proof that humanity can overcome its limitations, that we can be more than nature made us, that we can rewrite the rules. We spent millennia bound to the earth, envying birds, dreaming of flight, falling when we tried. And then, on a cold December day on a remote North Carolina beach, everything changed. Gravity didn't yield. Physics didn't change. But humanity rose anyway, because two brothers believed they could. And they were willing to risk everything to prove it. That's what flight means. Not just the physical ability to rise from the ground, but the mental ability to believe in the impossible, to pursue it, to work for it, to suffer for it, to fall again and again, bruised and broken, and get up to try again. That's real flight. And that's the real legacy of the Wright brothers. They didn't just teach us to fly, they taught us to dream. And then they taught us to turn those dreams into reality. 12 seconds. 120 feet. A machine of wood and fabric. Two stubborn brothers. And the world was never the same. The sky waited thousands of years. Patiently. Knowing eventually we would come. That eventually we would find the way. And we did. And now it's ours. Not completely. Never completely. The sky will always be dangerous. Always be challenging. Always demand respect. But it's ours. We can be there. We can move through it. We can use it to connect, explore, discover. All thanks to two brothers who survived brutal crashes to conquer the sky. And every time an airplane takes off, every time a child looks up in wonder, every time someone crosses an ocean in hours instead of weeks, we're honoring that legacy. We're flying. Like we always dreamed. Like we always knew someday we could. And as long as there's sky above us, there will be people looking up, wondering, dreaming, planning, building. Because the Wrights taught us something fundamental. They taught us that the impossible is temporary. That limits our suggestions. That dreams with enough work and enough courage can become real. We fly now, and we'll fly forever. Because two brothers showed us the way. But there's another side of the coin. A darker side. Because flight didn't just bring connection and progress. It also brought destruction on a scale the Wrights never imagined. We already talked about the wars. About the bombings. About cities in flames. But there's more. Much more. Flight changed war forever. And not just by making it more deadly. By making it more distant. More impersonal. A soldier in a trench sees his enemy, looks into his eyes, feels the weight of taking another human being's life. It's horrible, traumatic, but it's human. There's a connection even if it's the connection of shared horror. A pilot dropping bombs from 10,000 feet sees nothing, just buildings, targets, coordinates on a map. He presses a button, the bombs fall, and he flies away. He never sees the bodies. Never hears the screams, never smells the burning flesh. It's easier to kill when you don't see who you're killing. And airplanes made mass killing easier, cleaner, more efficient. During World War II, Allied bombers dropped 2,700,000 tons of bombs on Europe. 2,700,000 tons. Each bomb destroying lives, families, futures. In a single night, the bombing of Dresden killed 25,000 people. Maybe more. The exact numbers were lost in the chaos. The entire city became a firestorm. The heat was so intense that asphalt melted. People who took shelter in basements suffocated when the fire consumed all the oxygen. Hamburg, Tokyo, Berlin, Osaka, Cologne. The list goes on. Entire cities burned. Civilizations reduced to rubble. And all from the air. The pilots were good men. They weren't monsters. They had families. They loved their dogs. They wrote letters home. But they did monstrous things. Because war is monstrous, and flight made possible monstrosities that had been unimaginable before. And after the world wars, it didn't get better. The Cold War brought a new threat: nuclear bombers. Airplanes carrying hydrogen bombs. A single bomb could destroy an entire city. Millions dead in minutes. The United States and the Soviet Union had entire fleets of these bombers. Thousands of them. In the air constantly. Ready. Waiting for the order to launch the apocalypse. For decades, humanity lived under the threat of nuclear destruction dropped from the sky. Children practiced shelter drills in schools. Families built fallout shelters in their basements. Everyone knew that if nuclear war started, airplanes would bring the end of the world. It never happened. We were lucky, or wise enough, but it almost happened. Several times. And each time, airplanes would have been the carriers of death. Vietnam brought new horrors. Napalm dropped from airplanes. A gelatinous substance that stuck to skin and burned at 1,000 degrees. You couldn't put it out with water. It burned and burned until it consumed everything. The photographs of Vietnamese children running from napalm flames went around the world. A naked girl, her skin burning, screaming. That image defined the war. And the napalm had come from the sky. Agent Orange. Another product dropped from airplanes. A herbicide designed to kill the jungle. To strip the landscape bare and expose the enemy. But it also killed people. Caused cancer. Birth defects. 3 generations later, Vietnamese children are still born with deformities from Agent Orange. And it came from the sky. Sprayed from airplanes. Millions of gallons. Poisoning the land. Poisoning the people. For decades. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. The conflicts continue. And airplanes remain the preferred tools of destruction. Now they're more sophisticated. Drones. Remotely controlled from thousands of miles away. A pilot in Nevada controls a drone over Afghanistan. Watches through a camera. Sees figures moving on the ground. Receives the order. Presses a button. A missile launches. Explosion. Mission accomplished. The pilot finishes his shift. Drives home. Has dinner with his family. Helps his kids with homework. Sleeps in his own bed. On the other side of the world there are bodies. Maybe they were enemies. Maybe they were civilians. Hard to know from so far away. Hard to be sure. Distance makes everything easier. And more horrible. Drones have killed thousands. Enemy combatants, yes. But also civilians. Weddings bombed by mistake. Funerals. Markets. Schools. Collateral damage, they call it. As if calling it a technical term made it less horrible. As if those lives mattered less because they were errors. And all of this came from flight. From that innocent dream of rising like birds. Of conquering the sky. The Wrights wanted freedom. They wanted exploration. They wanted to touch the clouds. And humanity took their invention and turned it into the most efficient killing tool ever created. But there's more than just war. There are other costs. Other prices we pay for flying. The noise. Airplanes are loud. Millions of people live near airports. The constant roar of engines. All day. All night. Interrupting sleep. Causing stress. Affecting mental health. Studies show that people who live near airports have higher rates of heart disease. Of high blood pressure. Of anxiety. The constant noise damages the body. Damages the mind. And they can't leave. Not everyone can afford to move. So they suffer. Because we need airports. We need flights. And someone has to live with the noise. Pollution. Airplanes burn fossil fuel. Tons of it. A single transatlantic flight emits as much carbon dioxide as driving a car for months. And there are thousands of flights. Every day. Everywhere. Aviation contributes approximately 2.5% of global carbon emissions. Doesn't sound like much. But that's 1 billion tons of CO2 each year. Billion. Warming the planet. Melting glaciers. Raising sea levels. And it's increasing. More people fly each year. More routes. More airplanes. Emissions keep rising. Electric airplanes are in development, but they're decades away from being viable for long flights. Meanwhile, every takeoff contributes to climate change. Every flight accelerates global warming. And we keep flying. Because we've become dependent on it. Because we've built a civilization that requires flight. Contrails. Those white lines airplanes leave in the sky. They're not just water vapor. They're artificial clouds. And they trap heat. Some studies suggest the warming effect of contrails could be as large as the CO2 emissions from airplanes. We're literally changing the climate. Creating clouds where there shouldn't be any. Altering weather patterns. And we're just beginning to understand the consequences. Accidents. Yes, flying is safe. Statistically. But accidents still happen. And when they happen, they're catastrophic. Tenerife, 1977. Two Boeing 747s collided on the runway. 583 dead. The worst accident in aviation history. Lockerbie, 1988. A bomb destroyed a 747 over Scotland. 270 dead. Debris and bodies raining over a quiet town. 9/11, 2001. Airplanes used as weapons. Deliberately crashed into buildings. Almost 3,000 dead. Flight turned into a tool of terror. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. 2014. Disappeared. Simply disappeared. With 239 people on board. Never completely found. Families without answers. Without closure. Just eternal questions. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. 2019. A Boeing 737 MAX crashed minutes after takeoff. 157 dead. It was the second crash of the same airplane model in 5 months. Turned out there were design flaws. That the pursuit of profits had compromised safety. Each accident is a tragedy. Each victim was someone. With family. With dreams. With futures. And all trusted that the airplane would carry them safely. And it didn't. And then there's the psychological cost. The anxiety of flying. Millions of people are afraid to fly. Real fear. Paralyzing. Panic attacks on the airplane. Sweaty hands. Racing heart. Absolute terror. Because there's something fundamental about being 10,000 meters above the ground in a metal can. Something that goes against all our instincts. We're designed to be on the ground. To have solid earth under our feet. Flying is unnatural. And part of us always knows it. Always feels that primitive terror. That knowledge that if something goes wrong, we'll fall. And the fall will kill us. Most people overcome that fear. They force themselves to fly. Because they have to. Because there's no alternative in the modern world. But the fear is there. Always. And then there's the social cost. Airports have changed. Especially after 9/11. Now they're places of suspicion. Of extreme security. Of privacy invasion. They strip you with scanners. They check your bags. They interrogate you. They treat you like a potential threat. Like a potential terrorist. Until you prove otherwise. Hours in lines. Taking off your shoes. Your belt. Throwing away liquids. Being touched by strangers. It's degrading. Dehumanizing. But we accept it. Because we want to fly. Because we need to fly. And the social stratification. First class. Business class. Economy class. The same airplane but different worlds. The rich have seats that convert to beds. Gourmet food. Champagne. Space. Privacy. The poor are crammed into tiny seats. Knees against the seat in front. No space to move. Terrible food. No amenities. Paying extra for everything. For luggage. For food. For choosing your seat. Flight was supposed to be democratic. Supposed to be for everyone. And it is technically. But the experience is vastly different depending on how much you can pay. It's another reminder of inequality. Another symbol of the division between rich and poor. And there's the impact on local communities. When they build an airport, they displace people. They destroy neighborhoods. They take land. For the common good, they say. For progress. But the people who lose their homes don't always feel it was fair. don't always receive adequate compensation, don't always have a voice in the decision. And once the airport is there, it doesn't go away. It expands. More runways, more terminals, more flights, more noise, more pollution. And the nearby communities just have to endure it. This isn't to say flight is bad. Not completely. It's not black or white. It's gray. Like everything. Like all powerful technology. Flight has brought wonderful things. Connection. Opportunity. Progress. It has saved lives. It has united families. It has expanded horizons. But it has also brought destruction. Death. Pollution. Inequality. Terror from the sky. The Wrights opened a door. And what came through that door was everything. The best of humanity. And the worst. We can't close the door now. We can't uninvent flight. It's here. It's part of us. For better or worse, humanity flies now. And will keep flying. The question is, how do we use it? Do we choose connection or destruction? Exploration or exploitation? Freedom or terror? The answer, as always, is that we choose both. Because we're human. And humans are capable of great beauty and great horror. Often at the same time. The Wrights gave us the power to fly. But they couldn't control how we would use that power. No one can. That's the nature of invention. Once you release something to the world, it takes on a life of its own. And flight certainly did. But there's still hope. Because the same ingenuity that created flight can improve it. Can make it cleaner. Safer. More sustainable. More just. There are people working on electric airplanes. On sustainable fuels. On more efficient designs. On ways to reduce noise. On technologies that could make flight less harmful. And there are people working to ensure flight is used for good. For humanitarian aid. For rescue. For connection. For understanding between cultures. The future of flight isn't written. We're still deciding what it will be. What we want it to be. The Wrights started the journey. But we determine the destination. And that's both terrifying and exciting. Because it means we have power. We have choice. We have responsibility. The sky is ours now. The question is, what will we do with it? But let's talk about the other legacy of the Wrights. The technical legacy. The engineering legacy that changed how we build. How we design. How we solve problems. Because the Wrights didn't just build an airplane. They developed an entire approach to engineering. A method. A philosophy. They started with a problem. Not with a solution. Not with assumptions. With a real problem. How to control an airplane in flight. That was the problem. Other inventors had assumed the problem was power. You need a bigger engine. Stronger. That was their solution. The Wrights said no. The problem is control. And they solved that problem first. Before adding power. Before complicating things. That's fundamental engineering. Identify the real problem. Not the obvious problem. The real problem. They were also empirical. They didn't trust theories. They didn't trust what others had written. They trusted what they could measure. Test. Verify. They built that wind tunnel because they needed real data. Not data from books. Not equations on paper. Measured data. Verifiable. Repeatable. That's the basis of the scientific method. Observation. Hypothesis. Experiment. Analysis. Repeat. The Wrights applied it rigorously. Every flight was an experiment. Every accident was data. Every failure was information. They weren't discouraged by failures. They studied them. They learned from them. They used them to improve. That mindset is fundamental in modern engineering. Fail fast. Learn fast. Iterate. Improve. Tech companies today use this approach. Rapid prototyping. Testing. Adjustments. More testing. It's the same method the Wrights used. They were also multidisciplinary. They understood mechanics, aerodynamics, materials, engines, controls. They weren't narrow specialists. They were deep generalists. They could work with their hands. They could do calculations. They could design. They could build. They could pilot the entire development chain. That breadth is increasingly valuable. Complex problems require multidisciplinary thinking, require people who can connect different fields, different ideas. The Wrights were pioneers in that, without knowing it perhaps, but they were. And their specific design, the Flyer, it contained innovations we still use. Wing warping. Although modern airplanes use ailerons instead of twisting the whole wing, the principle is the same. Differential control of lift on each wing to turn. Every airplane flying today uses some form of that concept. The Wrights invented it. 3-axis control. Roll, pitch, yaw. 3 independent but coordinated controls. Essential for controlled flight. The Wrights were the first to understand you needed all 3. That you couldn't control an airplane with just 1 or 2. You needed complete control in all directions. Every modern airplane has this. Ailerons for roll. Elevators for pitch. Rudder for yaw. The names changed. The technology improved. But the concept is the same. Wright Flyer. Cessna 172. Boeing 787. 22 Raptor. All used 3-axis control. All used the principles the Wrights discovered. Also their approach to stability. The Wrights understood that an unstable airplane is more maneuverable, more controllable, more responsive. Seems counterintuitive. Don't you want stability? Don't you want the airplane to stay level automatically? The Wrights said no. A stable airplane is lazy. It resists your controls. An unstable airplane responds immediately. Does what you tell it. Modern fighter jets use this principle. They're designed to be inherently unstable. Computers keep them flying. But that instability makes them incredibly maneuverable. The Wrights understood this in 1903. Without computers, without sophisticated analysis, just observation and thought. And their work inspired generations of engineers, of designers, of thinkers. Every aerospace engineering program studies the Wrights, analyzes their designs, their methods, their solutions, not because they were perfect. They weren't. They made mistakes. They had wrong ideas. But their approach was solid. Their method was right. And that method extended beyond aviation. NASA uses Wright principles. When they design spacecraft, when they plan missions, when they solve problems no one has solved before. Test, learn, adjust, test again. It's the Wright cycle. And it works. SpaceX uses it. When they developed the Falcon 9, the first rockets exploded. Many of them. But each explosion taught something. Each failure improved the design. Now the Falcon 9 is the most reliable rocket in operation. It lands vertically. It's reusable. It does things that seemed impossible. Oh, with the right method. Test, fail, learn, improve, repeat. Elon Musk has cited the Wrights as inspiration, as a model. 2 guys in a workshop, without advanced degrees, without massive funding, just intelligence, hard work, and persistence. And they changed the world. That story inspires. It says you don't need to be part of a big institution. You don't need millions of dollars. You don't need impressive credentials. You need a good idea, a good method, and the will to work. The Wrights proved it, and others have proven it since. Innovators, entrepreneurs, people who started with nothing and built something extraordinary. Apple started in a garage. Google started in a dorm room. Amazon started in a basement. Facebook started in a college dorm. All followed the Wright model. Start small. Test your idea. Learn. Improve. Grow. It's a powerful legacy. Beyond any specific design. Beyond any piece of technology. It's a way of thinking. A way of approaching problems. And that legacy lives. In every garage where someone is building something new. In every lab where they're testing an idea. In every workshop where they're solving a problem. The Wrights didn't just teach us to fly. They taught us to innovate. And that might be even more important. Because flight is a technology. But innovation is a process. And that process can be applied to anything. to any problem, to any challenge. The Wrights solved the problem of flight, but their methods can solve thousands of other problems. Millions. Any problem that requires creative thinking, rigorous testing, and relentless persistence. That's the real technical legacy. Not the flyer. Not wing warping. Not three-axis control. It's the method, the approach, the philosophy. And it's a legacy that will keep bearing fruit as long as there are people willing to look at an impossible problem and say, I think I can solve this. Because that's what the Wrights did. They looked at the most impossible problem of their time. And they solved it. And if they could, who's to say we can't? Now, more than a century later, the Wright legacy lives in unexpected places. It's in museums. The original flyer hangs in the Smithsonian. Millions have seen it. Many walk under it without really understanding what they're seeing. It's just an old airplane, made of wood and fabric. It looks fragile, primitive. But some stop. They look up. They really look. And they feel something. A connection to the past. To a moment when everything changed. There are children who visit that museum. Children of 8 years old. Of 10. Of 12. They're there with their schools. Or with their families. Most are bored. Museums are boring for kids. But some kids look at the flyer and something clicks. Something awakens. A spark of curiosity. Of wonder. Of possibility. That kid goes home. Builds model airplanes. Reads about aviation. Studies physics. Math. Engineering. Goes to college. Majors in aeronautics. And maybe, just maybe, that kid grows up and designs the next big breakthrough in aviation. Or in space exploration. Or in some other field that doesn't even exist yet. Because they saw the flyer. And they understood that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That's the inspiration the Wrights provide. Not just technical. Human. Because they weren't special. Not at first. Not in obvious ways. They were mechanics. From a small town. Without impressive credentials. Without powerful connections. But they had curiosity. They had determination. They had each other. And they had the conviction that the problem could be solved. That's inspiring. For anyone. For everyone. If the Wrights could fly, what can you do? That question lives in the minds of people around the world. People in workshops. In laboratories. In garages. In dorm rooms. People who are working on their own impossible dreams. Their own unsolvable problems. Their own versions of flight. And when they get discouraged, when experiments fail, when people say it's impossible, they think of the Wrights. They think of two brothers on a remote beach, falling again and again, getting hurt, repairing their machine, trying again. And they think, if they kept going, I can too. That's the inspiration. That's the gift the Wrights gave the world. Not just flight, but the example. In Dayton, Ohio, there's another museum. Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historical Park. It includes the Wright brothers' bicycle shop. Preserved. Restored. You can go inside. See where they worked. The tools they used. The workbench where they built parts of the flyer. The wind tunnel where they tested wing designs. It's a modest place. Small. Not impressive. It doesn't look like the place where the world changed. But it is. This is where it happened. In this ordinary workshop. With ordinary tools. By ordinary people who refused to accept that flight was impossible. Visitors touch the workbench. Feel the wood. Try to imagine Wilbur and Orville here. Arguing. Drawing diagrams. Solving problems. And something transmits. Across time. Across space. A connection to those two brothers. To their dream. To their determination. You leave the museum different from how you entered. Not dramatically. Not obviously. But something changed. A small spark. A small seed of possibility. Maybe you too can build something. Create something. Solve something. Maybe your own limitations aren't as limiting as you thought. That's the power of memory. Of legacy. It's not just remembering. It's inspiring. And the Wrights inspire. So, after all this time, In Kitty Hawk there's a monument, at Kill Devil Hills to be exact. A large granite tower, 60 feet high, on the dune where the Wrights made their first gliding flights. The tower has been there since 1932. A reminder, a marker. This place matters. Something important happened here. There are plaques describing the flights. The 4 flights of December 17, 1903, with distances, times, details. And there are markers on the ground, showing where each flight landed. The first, 120 feet. The second, 175 feet. The third, 200 feet. The fourth, 852 feet. You can walk the distances. You can stand where Orville took off, where he landed. You can see how short it was, how close to the ground. And you might think, that's it? This is what all the fuss is about. But then you understand. It's not about distance. It's not about altitude. It's about that it happened. It's about that it was possible. It's about that it was first. Everything that came after. All the airplanes. All the flights. All the journeys. It all started here. With 120 feet. With 12 seconds. It's humbling and exciting to stand in the place where history changed, where humanity took a leap that defined us. Tourists come. They take photos. They walk the distances. Most don't think much about it. It's just another tourist attraction. Another place to check off the list. But some stay longer. They look at the sky. They imagine that cold December day. They imagine the sound of the engine, the wind, the moment when the flyer rose. And they feel something. A connection to the past. To that moment. To those men. Because the Wrights were human. Real. They were afraid. They felt pain. They doubted. But they did it anyway. And that makes them more inspiring. Not less. Because if they had been supermen, if they had been obvious geniuses, if it had been easy for them, it wouldn't be as inspiring. But it was hard. It was scary. It was painful. And they did it anyway. That's the power of their story. It's not about genius. It's about courage. About persistence. About refusing to give up. And anyone can have that. Anyone can choose not to give up. Anyone can choose to keep trying. The Wrights showed us how. They left a map. Not a technical map. An emotional map. Psychological. Spiritual. Identify your impossible problem. Study. Experiment. Fail. Learn. Adjust. Try again. Fail again. Learn more. Keep trying. Don't give up. Never give up. Eventually, with enough persistence, with enough learning, you'll succeed. You'll solve the unsolvable. You'll do the impossible. Not because you're special, but because you refuse to stop. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's the gift the Wrights gave us. And it lives in every person who faces an impossible challenge and decides to try anyway. In every scientist attacking a problem everyone says is unsolvable. In every entrepreneur building something everyone says won't work. In every child looking at the sky and wondering, what can I do? The Wrights answered that question. You can do anything. If you're willing to work for it. If you're willing to fail for it. If you're willing to keep trying when everyone tells you to stop. You can do anything. Even fly. And now at the end we look forward. Because flight hasn't finished evolving. Hasn't finished surprising us. Hasn't finished changing the world. Airplanes are bigger now. Faster. More efficient. The Airbus A380 can carry over 800 people. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner flies farther with less fuel than any airplane before. Supersonic airplanes are coming back. The Concorde died, but new companies are building successors. Flying New York to London in 3 hours. Los Angeles to Tokyo in 6. The world will keep getting smaller. More accessible. More connected. Hypersonic airplanes are in development. Speeds of Mach 5. Mach 10. New York to Sydney in 2 hours. Anywhere on Earth reachable in less than an afternoon. And then there's space. Because flight doesn't end at the atmosphere. It extends beyond. To the stars. SpaceX. Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, private companies building spaceships, making space travel accessible. First for the rich, eventually for everyone. Space tourism, hotels in orbit, bases on the moon, colonies on Mars. All this is possible. All this is being planned, built, tested. And it all started with the Wrights, with that first clumsy flight. With 12 seconds that opened infinity, Elon Musk has said he wants to die on Mars. Preferably not on impact, he jokes, but on Mars, as a citizen of another planet. That sounds crazy. But 120 years ago, flying sounded crazy. And now it's routine. 60 years ago, going to the moon sounded impossible. And then Neil Armstrong walked on it. Who says we won't be on Mars in 20 years? In 30? Who says we won't build cities on other worlds? If the Wrights could teach us to fly, what else can we learn to do? Drones are everywhere now. Small, cheap, easy to fly. Delivering packages, taking photographs, inspecting infrastructure, monitoring crops. Soon they'll deliver food, medicine, products, directly to your door. From the sky. Fast, efficient. Flying taxis are in development. Electric vehicles that take off and land vertically. They carry passengers over traffic, from one side of the city to the other in minutes. Sounds like science fiction. But prototypes are already flying. Companies are testing. Governments are writing regulations. It could be common in 10 years. In 15. Imagine. Not driving to the airport. A flying taxi picks you up at your house. Takes you directly to the terminal. Or directly to your destination. No traffic. No delays. The sky will become highway. Full of vehicles. Of people. Of packages. Of possibilities. And all because the Wrights taught us that the sky doesn't have to be empty. That we can fill it. That we can use it. But we also face challenges. Climate change is real. Aviation emissions are part of the problem. We need solutions. Electric airplanes. They're coming. For short distances first. Then longer distances. Batteries improve. Technology advances. Someday, maybe soon, we'll fly without burning fossil fuel. Without emissions. Clean. Sustainable. Synthetic fuels. Sustainable aviation fuels. Made from plants. From waste. From CO2 captured from the air. Carbon neutral. They work in existing airplanes. No need for new technology. They're more expensive now. But costs are dropping. Production is increasing. Could be the standard in 20 years. Flight doesn't have to destroy the planet. It can evolve. It can improve. It can become part of the solution, not just the problem. The Wrights gave us flight. We have to decide what to do with it. What kind of future to build. We can choose a future where flight connects without destroying. Where it moves without polluting. Where it inspires without terrorizing. It's possible. If we work for it. If we innovate. If we refuse to accept that the status quo is good enough. The Wrights didn't accept that flight was impossible. We shouldn't accept that flight has to be destructive. We can do better. We must do better. And we will. Because that's humanity. We face problems. We solve them. We create new problems. We solve those too. We keep moving forward. We keep improving. We keep flying higher. Because as long as there's sky above us, there will be people looking up. Dreaming. Planning. Building. Flying. The Wright brothers opened that door. And it will never close. The sky is ours now. Forever. And every time an airplane takes off. Every time a child looks up in wonder. Every time someone travels to a new place. Every time a family reunites across continents. Every time an idea crosses the world. Every time a dream rises. We're honoring the Wrights. We're living their legacy. We're flying their wings. Wilbur died young. Orville lived to see the beginning. But neither saw how far we'd go. How high we'd fly. Maybe that's better. Maybe it's better they left the legacy unfinished. They left the future open. They left room for other dreamers. Other builders. Other flyers. They passed us the torch, and we carry it higher, farther, to places they never imagined. And someday someone will carry that torch even farther, to the stars, to other galaxies, to places we can't imagine. Flight is just the beginning. It's the door, not the destination. It's the first step of a journey that never ends. The Wrights took that first step. 12 seconds, 120 feet, but infinite possibilities, because they opened the sky, and the sky has no limits. As long as there are humans looking up, as long as there's curiosity in our hearts, as long as there are impossible problems waiting to be solved, we'll fly higher, faster, farther. Not because it's easy, but because we're human, and humans fly now. It's what we do. It's who we are. The Wrights taught us that. They taught us that the ground isn't our limit, that we can rise, that we can touch the sky, and we'll keep rising, keep touching, keep reaching. Because as long as there's wind over Earth, there will be a human being who tries to understand it, and a silence waiting to be broken by the first beating of wings, and a voice that whispers, "I can fly," and a heart that responds, "Then fly," and a dream that will never, never, never give up. The Wrights survived brutal crashes to conquer the sky, and they gave us that sky. Now it's ours. Our responsibility, our destiny, our wings. Fly.